The history of the Tyranid threat within the Imperium of Man officially began in the late 41st millennium, not with a roar of cannons, but with a profound and terrifying silence. The location was the Eastern Fringe, a region of the galaxy already known for its lawlessness and distance from the guiding light of the Astronomicon. Here on the ocean world of Tyran Primus, the Adeptus Mechanicus had established a secretive outpost intended to study the unique atmospheric conditions and marine biology of the planet. It was a remote station, largely forgotten by the wider administratum, until the astropathic choir on the nearby sector capital ceased receiving routine data bursts. The silence was absolute, prompting the intervention of the Inquisition. Inquisitor Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos was the first to investigate the anomaly. Upon his arrival in the Tyran system, he did not find a world in rebellion or a station under occupation by pirate forces. He found a tomb. As his vessel entered high orbit, the sensors registered a discrepancy that defied geological logic. Tyran Primus, once a world of deep, turbulent oceans and cloud-wreathed archipelagos, was gone. In its place hung a dead sphere of barren rock. The atmosphere had been stripped away entirely, leaving the surface exposed to the cold vacuum of the void. The oceans, accounting for over 80% of the planet's mass, had vanished without a trace. Kryptman led a survey team to the surface, clad in void-hardened power armor, walking across the dry, dusty seabed that stretched for thousands of miles. The Adeptus Mechanicus outpost, a fortress of plasteel and ceramite designed to withstand hurricanes, was intact but breached. There were no bodies, no blood, and no signs of conventional warfare. The defenders had not been conquered, they had been consumed. Deep within the command sanctum of the station, Kryptman recovered a single data codex that had miraculously survived the purge. The footage contained within offered the Imperium its first glimpse of the Great Devourer. The recordings depicted the sky darkening not with clouds, but with billions of spore pods raining down from the upper atmosphere. It showed the waters boiling as millions of weapon organisms emerged from the depths, and the skies choking with winged horrors that blotted out the sun. The final logs captured the frantic screams of tech priests as the very air was sucked from the station, siphoned off by massive bioships anchored in low orbit. Kryptman realized he was looking at an extragalactic apex predator, a species that did not seek territory or political dominion, but biomass. He named the species Tyranids, after the dead world on which he stood, and identified the invasion force as Hive Fleet Behemoth. This marked the official recognition of the Tyranid threat, a pivotal moment that shifted the strategic calculus of the entire Ultima segmentum. Preceding the physical arrival of the bioships was a phenomenon that would prove to be as deadly as the Tyranids themselves, the shadow in the warp. This psychic blanketing effect was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but a byproduct of the hive mind's synaptic control. The hive mind is the gestalt consciousness of the Tyranid race, a psychic presence of such magnitude that it drowns out all other warp signatures. As Hive Fleet Behemoth moved through the void, the billions of creatures comprising it generated a psychic static that smothered the Imperium for light years in every direction. For the Imperium, which relies entirely on the warp for communication and travel, the effects were catastrophic. Astropaths, the blind psychers responsible for interstellar communication, were the first to feel the approach of the shadow. They described it as a rising cacophony of alien hunger, a scratching at the walls of their minds that grew louder until it became an unbearable scream. On worlds in the path of Behemoth, astropathic choirs burned out, their brains liquefied by the pressure of the hive mind, or they were driven into irrevocable madness, clawing at their own eyes to escape the visions of endless devouring maws. The tactical implications of the shadow in the warp were immediate and devastating. With astropathic communication severed, planetary governors could not call for aid. Systems under attack were isolated, cut off from the sector command. Furthermore, the turbulence created in the warp made reliable travel nearly impossible. Imperial Navy vessels attempting to jump into systems affected by the shadow often found themselves thrown off course, lost in the tides of the Empyrean, or forced to drop back into real space light years from their destination. The Tyranids had effectively weaponized the background noise of their own existence to create a fog of war that blinded the Imperium to their movements. By the time a system realized it was under attack, The shadow had already descended, ensuring that no distress signal could escape and no reinforcements could arrive. Under the cover of this psychic blackout, Hive Fleet Behemoth surged into the Ultima Segmentum with relentless momentum. It carved a path of destruction through the void, ignoring strategic strongpoints that offered no biological resources and focusing entirely on worlds teeming with life. The Hive Fleet acted as a single, cohesive organism, adapting to resistance with terrifying speed. If a world fought back with massed infantry, the hive mind deployed anti-personnel bioforms. If the defenders relied on armor, the Tyranids spawned massive crushing beasts. The advance brought the alien fleet to the borders of Ultramar, the sovereign realm of the Ultramarines chapter. This region, consisting of 500 habitable worlds, was a bastion of order and civilization in a galaxy of chaos. Among these worlds was Prandium, known as the Jewel of Ultramar. Prandium was an agri-world of unparalleled beauty, renowned for its golden climatic balance and lush, carefully tended ecosystems. It was not a fortress world. Its value lay in its natural splendor and its vast agricultural output that fed billions across the subsector. It was a place where veteran space marines would sometimes go to walk amidst the forests, a reminder of the peace they fought to preserve. When Behemoth descended upon Prandium, the consumption was absolute. The planetary defense forces, though disciplined and well-equipped by the standards of the Imperial Guard, were utterly unprepared for the scale of the assault. The sky turned a bruised purple as mycetic spores choked the atmosphere. The forests, tended for thousands of years, were dissolved by pools of hyper-acidic digestive fluids. The Tyranids did not just kill the population, they harvested the biosphere. Capillary towers, organic structures reaching kilometers into the sky, pumped the liquefied biomass of the planet up to the waiting bioships in orbit. Within weeks, Prandium was stripped bare. The Jewel of Ultramar was reduced to a lifeless rock, indistinguishable from Tyran Primus. The psychological impact on the Ultramarines was profound. The loss of Prandium was not merely a strategic defeat, it was a violation of their home. It demonstrated that the Tyranids did not respect the sanctity of the 500 worlds. The biomass harvested from Prandium served to gorge the Hive Fleet, swelling its numbers and replenishing its energy reserves for the push toward the heart of the realm. The message was clear: nothing in Ultramar was safe, and the hunger of the Great Devourer was insatiable. As the reports from the outlying system ceased, silenced by the shadow, and the fate of Prandium became known, the gravity of the situation settled upon the fortress monastery on Macragge. Marnius Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines and lord of Macragge, recognized that this was an existential threat unlike any other. This was not an Orc that could be broken by killing its warboss, nor a chaos incursion driven by the whims of dark gods. This was a biological storm. Calgar declared a state of total war across the entirety of Ultramar. His mobilization orders were executed with the legendary logistical efficiency for which the Sons of Guilliman are known. He did not attempt to defend every world in the path of the fleet, realizing that dispersing his forces would lead to defeat in detail. Instead, he made the cold, tactical decision to draw the enemy in. He issued a recall order to the Ultramarines' active companies scattered across the galaxy. Strike cruisers and battle barges broke off from crusades and patrol routes, burning their engines to the limit to return to the Macragge system before the shadow closed the warp routes entirely. Crucially, Calgar recalled the elite First Company, the veterans of the chapter. These warriors, clad in Terminator armor and wielding the finest relics of the armory, were the hammer of the Ultramarines. Their presence on Macragge indicated that Calgar intended to make his stand on the capital world itself. The Ultramar Defense Auxilia, the highly trained human soldiers of the realm, were mobilized in the millions. Reserve regiments were activated, and armories were thrown open. The fortification of Macragge began in earnest. The capital world was already one of the most heavily defended planets in the Imperium, but Calgar ordered the defenses tripled. The orbital grid was reinforced with additional weapons platforms, creating a kill zone that any approaching fleet would have to traverse. Giant orbital defense lasers, capable of cracking the hulls of capital ships, were primed and calibrated. On the ground, the polar fortresses, massive citadels built into the ice and rock of the planet's north and south poles, were stocked with ammunition, supplies, and fuel to withstand a siege of indefinite duration. These fortresses protected the primary laser batteries that provided the planet's surface-to-orbit defensive umbrella. The immense battle barges of the chapter, immense Gothic cathedrals of war, were positioned in high orbit, forming a steel wall against the approaching bioships. Calgar's strategy relied on the discipline of his troops and the impregnability of Macragge's defenses to break the back of the invasion. He understood that the Tyranids could not be bargained with or routed by fear. They had to be exterminated, cell by cell. As the psychic darkness of the Shadow and the Warp began to bleed into the Macragge system, dimming the light of the Astronomicon and bringing nightmares to the sleeping populace, the Ultramarines stood ready. Bolters were consecrated, oaths of moment were sworn, and the Lord of Macragge waited for the beast to arrive at his gates. The fortification of Macragge was not merely a military deployment, it was the transformation of an entire world into a single, cohesive weapon system. While the Fortress of Hera stood as the spiritual and command heart of the chapter, the true strategic keys to the planet's survival lay in the desolate, frozen wastelands of the north and south. The geography of Macragge is dominated by rugged mountain ranges and disciplined, sprawling habitation zones, but the poles are hostile environments of biting winds and perpetual ice. It was here, buried beneath layers of rockcrete, ceramite, and kilometers of glacial ice, that the twin polar fortresses were situated. These citadels were miracles of darker age engineering, maintained with religious fervor by the tech marines of the chapter and the local priesthood of the Mechanicus. They were not designed to house populations or facilitate trade. Their sole function was to protect and power the planetary defense laser batteries. These were not standard surface-to-air arrays used to deter atmospheric fighters. The guns of the polar fortresses were colossal, silo-housed energy weapons capable of projecting focused lances of coherent light into high orbit. Their range and power were sufficient to boil the armor off a capital ship or shatter the carapace of a Hive ship thousands of kilometers in the void. The strategic necessity of these fortresses dictated the entire defensive plan. If the polar fortresses fell, the defense lasers would be silenced. Without the covering fire of those surface-based batteries, the Tyranid fleet would be able to descend into low orbit with impunity, overwhelming the Imperial naval assets through sheer attrition and saturation. Conversely, if the naval blockade in the void was broken, the Tyranids could bombard the fortresses from space until they were nothing but craters. The defense of Macragge relied on a symbiotic relationship between the ground and the void. One could not survive without the other. To secure the surface, Marneus Calgar deployed the full might of the Ultramarines chapter, a gathering of Astartes rarely seen since the days of the Great Crusade. While the battle companies were distributed across key population centers and the Fortress of Hera to repel the inevitable spore landings, the defense of the critical polar fortresses was entrusted to the elite. The first company, the veterans of the chapter, were split into two task forces. These were warriors who had earned the right to wear Terminator armor, the tactical dreadnought suits that turned a single space marine into a walking tank. They were armed with storm bolters, assault cannons, and cyclone missile launchers, weapons designed to tear through the densest armor. They took up positions within the icy corridors and plasteel bunkers of the poles, turning the facilities into kill zones where every angle of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Supporting the Astartes was the Ultramar Auxilia. Unlike the standard planetary defense forces found on most Imperial worlds, often ill-equipped and poorly trained, the Auxilia were professional soldiers, drilled to a standard that rivaled the Imperial Guard regiments of Cadia or Armageddon. They were equipped with void-sealed carapace armor and high-output las rifles capable of puncturing alien chitin. Millions of these soldiers were entrenched in the defensive networks surrounding the major Hive cities and the approaches to the polar regions. They manned the Aegis defense lines, the Hydra flak batteries, and the Earthshaker artillery emplacements. They were the anvil against which the Tyranid swarm was expected to break, holding the line to allow the Space Marines to deliver the killing blows. However, the defense of Macragge was not limited to infantry and tanks. From the grand hangars and subterranean vaults of the planet's industrial districts walked the god machines of the Adeptus Titanicus. The Legio Praetor, known in Low Gothic as the Fire Lords, had long been sworn to the defense of Ultramar. They deployed their maniples to the surface, their void shields shimmering in the thin mountain air. Warlord-class titans, towering behemoths of destruction, stood sentinel over the primary approaches to the fortress of Hera. Their weapon loadouts were optimized for mass slaughter. Vulcan mega bolters to shred waves of lesser bioforms and turbo laser destructors to hunt the massive bio-titans that the Tyranids would inevitably deploy. The presence of the Legio Praetor added a layer of super heavy firepower that few worlds in the Imperium could boast, their war horns ready to answer the alien shriek of the hive mind. Above the atmosphere, the defensive preparations were equally formidable. Macragge's orbital space was a grid of death. The primary defense platforms, massive Star Nova-class stations, were fully crewed and powered. These stations carried weapon batteries that rivaled those of a battleship, along with hangars filled with Fury interceptors and Starhawk bombers. Between the stations lay vast minefields, seeded with proximity-detonated fusion charges designed to break the momentum of the initial Tyranid rush. Anchoring this line of steel were the ships of the Ultramarines fleet. The battle barges Octavius and Caesar, along with a dozen strike cruisers and escort squadrons, held a high-anchored geostationary position. They were positioned to provide overlapping void shields for the orbital platforms and to concentrate their bombardment cannons on the largest concentrations of bio-ships. Marnius Calgar, commanding from the stratagem of the Fortress of Hera, faced a tactical dilemma that would have paralyzed a lesser commander. The standard Imperial naval doctrine against Tyranids, to engage at maximum range and kite the enemy, was impossible. He had to hold Macragge. He could not retreat into the deep void to maneuver. The Tyranid fleet, Hive Fleet Behemoth, was not a conventional armada that utilized supply lines or formations. It was a biological avalanche. The Tyranids did not care about casualties. They would hurl millions of drone ships and spore mines into the guns of the Imperial fleet to deplete their ammunition and overwhelm their sensors, masking the approach of the true heavyweights, the Hive ships and Norn Queens. Calgar's dilemma lay in the allocation of his fire support. If he ordered the fleet and the ground lasers to target the smaller escort drones, the massive Hive ships would survive to disgorge their invasion swarms. If he focused entirely on the capital ships, the millions of smaller organisms would make planetfall unchecked, drowning the defenders in a tide of claws and teeth. He had to strike a balance, utilizing the precision of the Astartes boarding torpedoes and Thunderhawk gunships to surgically strike key bioships while the massive macro cannons and lance batteries engaged the bulk of the fleet. He had to accept that total interdiction was impossible. The spores would land. The surface war was inevitable. His goal was not to prevent the invasion, but to strip it of enough mass in orbit that the ground forces had a fighting chance of survival. The psychological atmosphere on Macragge in those final days of preparation was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread, tempered only by the iron discipline of the Ultramarines' rule. The shadow in the warp had fully descended. The light of the Astronomicon was gone, leaving the navigators blind and the astropaths screaming in their cells. For the common citizenry, the shadow manifested as a pervasive sense of being watched by something ancient and hungry. Sleep brought no rest, only fevered dreams of consumption and drowning in organic fluids. Productivity in the manufactorums did not slow, but the workers moved with a frantic energy, driven by the instinctual terror that the end was approaching. The Astartes were immune to fear, their psycho-conditioning and genetic enhancement rendering them incapable of the panic that gripped mortals. Yet even they felt the pressure. The air in the Fortress of Hera tasted of ozone and recycled promethium. The chaplains walked the ramparts, reciting the catechisms of hate, their voices amplified by vox grills to remind the brothers of their duty. There was no bravado, no boasting of glory. The Ultramarines were practical warriors. They checked their bolt gun magazines, consecrated their chainswords with sacred oils, and ran diagnostic cycles on their power armor for the 100th time. They knew the enemy they faced. The Tyranids offered no parley, no honor, and no surrender. They were an enemy that stripped the dignity from death, reducing a fallen warrior to nothing more than biological sludge to be drunk by the earth. The sky above Macragge began to change. The familiar blue, usually crisp and clear in the mountain air, took on a sickly, bruised hue. It was the first physical sign of the spore clouds entering the upper ionosphere, a microscopic vanguard preceding the solid matter of the fleet. The stars were blotted out, not by clouds, but by the sheer density of the biomass approaching the system. Sensors on the orbital platforms began to scream warnings as the biostatic, the jamming effect caused by millions of Tyranid organisms, washed over the fleet. It was a wall of noise that blinded long-range augers and disrupted targeting matrices. In the command center of the northern polar fortress, Captain Saul Invictus of the First Company stood watching the tactical hololiths. The display was awash of red icons, a solid tide flowing toward the solitary blue sphere of Macragge. Beside him, the Terminator veterans stood in silent vigil, the servos of their massive armor humming in the sub-zero cold of the citadel. They were the shield of Macragge. They had been entrusted with the most crucial ground objective on the planet. If the aliens wanted to silence the guns that protected the sky, they would have to walk through the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. The first contact was not a singular event, but a simultaneous eruption of violence across the entire orbital grid. The Tyranid vanguard, consisting of thousands of Kraken and escort-class bioships, surged forward without deceleration. They did not fire energy weapons, they fired themselves. They launched boarding tentacles, acid-filled spore mines, and millions of smaller attack organisms directly at the Imperial steel. The void lit up with the silent fury of laser batteries and plasma torrents. The defense lasers of the polar fortresses roared to life, columns of blinding white light piercing the atmosphere and striking the lead elements of the Hive Fleet. Where the beams hit, bioships vaporized, their organic hulls boiling away into gas. But for every ship destroyed, 3 more pushed through the debris field. The battle barge Caesar shook as it took impacts on its void shields, the energies flaring violet against the black of space. On the surface, the first mycetic spores began to streak through the atmosphere, burning with the heat of re-entry. They looked like a rain of meteors, a fiery deluge aimed not at random, but guided by the hive mind toward the population centers and, crucially, the polar citadels. The waiting auxilia gripped their las rifles tighter, looking up at the burning sky. The time for preparation was over. The consumption of Macragge had begun. The engagement did not begin with the orderly exchange of broadsides typical of naval warfare between civilized powers. It began as a collision. As the main body of Hive Fleet Behemoth crossed the engagement threshold of the Macragge system, the tactical displays aboard the Imperial vessels washed out, overwhelmed by a density of targets that the machine spirits of the cogitators could not process. The Tyranid fleet was not a formation of individual vessels, but a biological slurry, a 3-dimensional cloud of organisms ranging from microscopic spores to bioships the size of continents. The system monitors, small patrol craft, and automated defense platforms stationed at the system's manville points were the first to be erased. They were not destroyed by precision lance strikes, but were simply overrun, crushed beneath the sheer kinetic mass of the advancing swarm, or dissolved by clouds of acidic vapor that preceded the fleet like a nebula of poison. The system monitors attempted to fire their magazines, unleashing torrents of torpedoes into the oncoming wall of flesh. While warheads detonated and tore massive rents in the leading bioships, the damage was instantly rendered irrelevant. The hive mind did not mourn the loss of its vanguard, it used the debris. The carcasses of dead Kraken ships became ablative armor for the organisms behind them, and the frozen blood of ruptured leviathans formed a fog that scattered the targeting lasers of the defenders. Within the first hour of contact, the outer perimeter of Macragge's naval defense had ceased to exist, converted into drifting debris fields that were already being consumed by feeder organisms. As the biofleet pushed deeper into the gravity well, aiming for the high orbit of Macragge, the heavy assets of the Ultramarines engaged. The battle barge Severian, a colossus of adamantium and ceramite that had served the chapter since the days of the Great Scouring, moved to intercept the densest concentration of Hive ships. Flanked by the strike cruiser Caesar and a squadron of Gladius-class frigates, the Severian opened fire with its dorsal bombardment cannons. In the void there is no sound, but the recoil of the massive macro batteries shuddered through the superstructure of the ship, a vibration felt in the bones of every crewman. The shells, each the size of a hab block, crossed the void in seconds, slamming into the organic armor of the approaching Hive ships. The impact was gruesome. Unlike the clean detonations against void shields or metal hulls, the bombardment of Tyranid vessels resulted in the eruption of visceral fluids. Chitin shattered like glass, and pressurized internal organs vented into the vacuum, freezing instantly into red crystals. The Severians' gunnery crews maintained a punishing rate of fire, their targeting matrices locking onto the synaptic nodes of the bioships, the bulbous, brain-like structures that coordinated the swarm. However, the Tyranid response was immediate and horrifyingly adaptable. The Hive fleet did not scatter, it contracted. Like a muscle flexing, the swarm tightened its formation, bringing millions of smaller organisms to the front to act as a living shield. The Caesar, attempting to execute a flanking maneuver to rake the underbelly of a massive Hive ship, found itself sailing into a minefield of living ordnance. Spore mines, drifting silently in the dark, sensed the heat of the strike cruiser's plasma drives. They drifted inward, their tentacles trailing, and detonated upon contact with the ship's void shields. These were not chemical explosions, but bursts of bioacid and viral pathogens so potent they ate through the energy fields, forcing the Caesar's generators to overload. Once the shields flickered and died, the true nature of Tyranid void warfare revealed itself. It was not a gunnery duel, it was a feeding frenzy. Kraken ships, agile and predatory cruisers equipped with massive hooking tentacles, surged forward from the biomass cloud. They ignored the point defense turrets that shredded their secondary limbs and slammed physically into the flanks of the Imperial cruisers. The sound of metal screaming against chitin reverberated through the hulls as the bioships latched on. These were not merely ramming attacks, they were parasitic attachments. From the bellies of the Kraken ships, reinforced boarding tubes made of hardened cartilage and muscle punched through the armored skin of the Ultramarines' vessels. They bypassed airlocks and bulkheads, boring directly into the corridors and gun decks. The Caesar reported hull breaches on decks 4 through 9 immediately. The boarding parties were not disorganized beasts but specialized shock troops. Gene-stealers, creatures of pure reflex and razor-sharp claws, poured into the ship's interior. In the confined spaces of a starship, the gene-stealers were engines of slaughter, moving faster than the human eye could track, tearing through naval armsmen and servitors with terrifying efficiency. The Astartes aboard the Caesar responded with the disciplined fury for which they were renowned. Squads of tactical Marines established kill zones at the intersections of the primary corridors, their bolters creating a wall of mass reactive fire. The roar of bolters filled the stale air of the ship, the explosive rounds detonating inside the alien bodies, reducing the first wave of gene-stealers to wet slurry. But for every Xenos killed, 3 more scrambled over the corpses. Lictors, chameleonic assassin beasts, utilized the chaos to infiltrate the ventilation shafts and maintenance crawlspaces. They did not seek open combat, but hunted the ship's officers and astropaths, seeking to blind the vessel and sever its chain of command. On the bridge of the Severian, the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The augurs showed that the Hive fleet was effectively ignoring the losses inflicted by the heavy guns. For every Hive ship the battle barge broke apart, 2 more drifted past its firing arc, oblivious to the destruction of their kin. The Tyranids were not trying to win a naval victory in the traditional sense, they were trying to achieve orbital saturation. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of ships to place their heavy carriers in low orbit over the planet. The horror of the engagement escalated as the bioships unleashed their primary weapon systems. These were not lasers or plasma, but weaponized biology. Massive pyro-acid batteries mounted on the dorsal ridges of the Hive ships spasmed, spitting globules of corrosive fluid the size of dropships across the void. When these struck the Imperial vessels, they did not detonate, they splashed and clung. The acid began to eat through the adamantium hull plating, dissolving sensors, weapon mountings, and the bridge viewports. The Severian was bathed in this toxic rain, its golden heraldry sizzling away to reveal the raw gray plasteel beneath. Simultaneously, the Hive ships launched feeder tentacles, gigantic, pulsating appendages kilometers in length. These lashed out at the smaller Imperial frigates like the tongues of frogs catching flies. One of the Gladius-class escorts, the Blade of Connor, was ensnared. The tentacles wrapped around the frigate's engines, crushing the drive cones, and dragging the helpless ship into the maw of a Hive ship. The crew of the Severian could only watch on their tactical hololiths as the blade of Connor was pulled against the ventral surface of the alien Leviathan, where grinder organs and digestive enzymes began to break the ship down into raw metal and biomass, while the reactor was still active. Despite the carnage in the void, the strategic cogitators of the Ultramarines identified a shift in the Tyranid behavior. The hive mind had recognized the threat posed by the surface defenses. The orbital defense lasers of the polar fortresses were taking a fearsome toll. Every few seconds, a lance of coherent light from the planet's surface would pierce the darkness, spearing a bioship and boiling it from the inside out. These ground-based batteries were protected by void shields and kilometers of rock, making them invulnerable to the acid rain and bioplasma of the fleet. As long as the polar lasers fired, the Tyranids could not anchor their capillary towers to begin the consumption of the planet. The hive mind reacted with a cold, binary logic. It ceased its attempts to engage the Severian and the Caesar directly, instead utilizing its remaining escort drones to form a dense blockade around the heavy Imperial ships, effectively trapping them in a cage of living bodies. With the Ultramarines' fleet pinned down by the sheer volume of interceptor organisms, the massive Hive ships rolled in the void, exposing their ventral bomb bays toward the planet below. They did not fire on the lasers directly, for the atmospheric distortion reduced the effectiveness of their bioplasma from orbit. Instead, they deployed the invasion swarm. The belly of the fleet opened, and millions of mycetic spores were ejected into the gravity well. This was not a general dispersal, it was a targeted strike. The tactical officers aboard the Severian watched with dawning horror as the trajectory analysis confirmed the enemy's intent. The spores were not aiming for the population centers or the fortress of Hera. They were converging on two specific coordinates, the north and south poles. The sky above Macragge, already bruised purple by the shadow and the warp, turned into a sheet of fire. The ray entry trails of the spores created a lattice of burning light that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sheer number of pods overwhelmed the ground-based Hydra batteries. For every spore shot down by flak, 1,000 more continued their descent. These were not merely transport vessels, they were ablative shields for the heavy hitters contained within. The initial wave consisted of empty, armored pods designed to trigger proximity mines and absorb laser fire. Behind them came the heavier spores, carrying carnifexes, Tyranid warriors, and the command beasts of the swarm. The Tyranids had deduced that the only way to silence the guns was to dig them out. They were deploying the equivalent of a planetary assault force directly onto the ice caps. The battle barge Severian attempted to pursue, firing its thrusters to break free of the bio-blockade, but the density of the debris field and the grappling tentacles of the suicide ships held it fast. The fleet was effectively neutralized, not by destruction, but by isolation. The battle for Macragge had transitioned from the cold vacuum of space to the frozen hell of the polar wastes. As the first spores slammed into the glacial ice surrounding the northern fortress, the impact tremors registered on seismographs as far away as Magna Macragge Civitas. The pods burst open, steaming in the sub-zero air, and the snow was instantly stained black with alien ichor. From the wreckage of the landing pods rose the first shapes of the invasion force, 6-limbed horrors with chitinous armor that steamed in the cold, their weapon symbiotes chittering in anticipation. The silence of the poles, undisturbed for millennia save for the howling wind, was broken by the alien shriek of the hive mind asserting its dominion over the soil of Ultramar. Inside the Caesar, the situation had devolved into a brutal deck-by-deck purgatory. The first officer, commanding in the absence of the captain who was leading a counter-boarding action in the Engineerium, ordered the venting of the port launch bays. The atmosphere was purged, sucking hundreds of genestealers into the void, but the creatures had already compromised the life support cyclers. The air aboard the strike cruiser was becoming thick with alien spores, clogging the rebreathers of the crew. The Tyranids were terraforming the ship from the inside, turning the corridors of the Caesar into an extension of the hive. The strategic necessity of the moment became clear to Marnius Calgar on the surface. The fleet had done all it could. They had forced the Tyranids to pay a blood price for every kilometer of orbit, but the blockade was absolute. The defense of Macragge now rested entirely on the ability of the polar garrisons to hold the line. If the lasers fell, the fleet would be picked apart at leisure. The chapter master watched the orbital feeds, seeing the Severian firing its maneuvering thrusters in a desperate bid to bring its broadsides to bear on the spore streams, but it was like a whale thrashing in a net of krill. The Void War was effectively suspended. The outcome would be decided by bolter and blade on the ice. The descent of the spores continued for hours, a relentless bombardment that buried the outer defensive lines of the polar citadels under mountains of organic debris. The heat from the ray entry and the subsequent plasma fires began to melt the surface ice, creating rivers of slush and steam that obscured vision and fouled the tracks of the Imperial tanks. Through this fog of war, the Tyranid ground forces began their advance, an endless carpet of gaunts and rippers moving with a singular, terrifying purpose toward the shield generators of the fortresses. The Battle of Macragge had officially made planetfall. The transition from orbital bombardment to planetary invasion was not marked by a lull in the violence, but by a shift in medium. As the mycetic spores punched through the cloud layer, the skies above the northern and southern polar caps ceased to resemble a planetary atmosphere, and instead took on the appearance of a bruised, weeping wound. The friction of millions of biological pods entering the atmosphere at terminal velocity ignited the air itself. From the viewpoint of the entrenched Ultramarines' First Company, the horizon was a cascading wall of fire, a continuous sheet of ray entry burns that bathed the eternal ice of the poles in a hellish, flickering orange light. This was not a precision drop. The hive mind did not seek to land troops in tactical formations or secure landing zones in the traditional military sense. It sought to drown the defenders in biomass. The spores did not decelerate with retro thrusters, they simply impacted. The surrounding glaciers shattered under the kinetic force of the bombardment. Craters the size of hab blocks were gouged into the ice, instantly filling with steam as the heat of the pods vaporized the frozen terrain. The noise was a continuous, deafening roar, a geological rumble that shook the foundations of the rockcrete bunkers and rattled the sensory spines of the waiting titans of the Legio Praetor. When the pods burst open, they did not release soldiers, but a tide. The first wave consisted of the expendable chaff of the Hive Fleet, hormagaunts and termagants numbering in the tens of millions. These creatures were little more than biological delivery systems for claws and flesh-borer beetles, driven by a synaptic imperative that overrode all instincts of self-preservation. They scrambled over the smoking wreckage of their own landing pods, stepping on the broken bodies of their kin who had not survived the impact, and surged toward the Imperial lines. The discipline of the Ultramarines' First Company was the only thing that prevented an immediate rout of the auxiliary forces. The veterans, clad in the heavy ceramite plates of tactical dreadnought armor, stood as immovable anchors within the defensive network. They did not fire indiscriminately. Every burst from a storm bolter was a calculated action, a 3-round suppression pattern designed to shatter the chitinous skulls of the leading aliens. The overlapping fields of fire established by the Astartes created a death zone, extending 500 meters from the perimeter of the primary bunkers. Into this zone, the Tyranids poured like water into a drain. The mass-reactive shells of the Astartes bolters detonated deep within the ribcage of the gaunts, blowing them apart in sprays of alien ichor. Heavy bolter emplacements, manned by the Auxilia and supervised by tech marines, churned out a continuous stream of high-explosive rounds that reduced the front ranks of the swarm to a bloody slurry. However, the Tyranids did not stop. They did not take cover. The dead did not impede the advance, they facilitated it. The corpses of the first wave filled the tank traps and razor wire trenches, creating ramps of flesh for the second wave to scramble over. The defenders were not fighting an army, they were fighting a rising fluid level of biological matter. It was during this initial engagement that the terrifying adaptability of the Tyranid race first manifested on a tactical level. In the opening minutes, the standard issue lasguns of the Ultramar defense auxilia were effective against the lighter gaunt organisms, the focused beams punching through the thinner carapace plates. The hive mind, observing this through the eyes of synapse creatures stationed in the rear, reacted instantly. The next wave of gaunts that emerged from the crashing spores displayed a subtle but deadly mutation. Their chitin was denser, secreted with a resinous coating that refracted the thermal energy of the law's fire. Auxilia troopers watched in horror as their shots, which had been killing the beasts moments before, now merely scored the alien armor, leaving the creatures wounded but fully combat-capable. The defensive line began to buckle under the sheer weight of the assault. It required the intervention of the heavy support elements to stabilize the front. The warlord titans of the Legio Praetor, towering above the ice fields like mechanical gods, leveled their Vulcan mega-bolters. These weapons, designed to strip the void shields from enemy engines, turned the snow plains into a slaughterhouse. The rotary cannons spun with a sound like tearing canvas, unleashing thousands of rounds per second that disintegrated entire grid squares of the advancing swarm. Yet even the god machines were not immune to the tactical evolution of the enemy. Recognizing the threat of the Titans, the hive mind deployed its heavy shock troops. The ground shuddered as carnifexes, living battering rams of muscle and hardened carapace, lumbered from the larger spore pods. These were not the mindless beasts often encountered in feral broods. These were screamer killers, bioengineered for the specific purpose of breaking fortified lines. They did not charge blindly into the Titan fire. Instead, they utilized the cover of the spore clouds and the distraction of the lesser swarms to close the distance. Simultaneously, the skies above the battlefield darkened further as winged gargoyles and harpies descended from the upper atmosphere. They did not attack the ground troops directly, but focused on blinding the defenders. They spat caustic venom at the sensors of the Titans and the targeting arrays of the bunkers. The acidic slime ate through glass and plasteel, clouding the lenses of the Imperial war machines. Deprived of clear visuals, the accuracy of the heavy weapons degraded, allowing the carnifexes and Tyranid warriors to push closer to the perimeter walls. The combat at the poles devolved into a brutal close-quarters grinding match. In the labyrinthine trench networks surrounding the defense lasers, Terminators fought back-to-back, their lightning claws and thunder hammers rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence of destruction. A sergeant of the First Company, wielding a heavy flamer, bathed a corridor of ice in promethium fire, turning a rushing brood of genestealers into ash. But for every Xenos burned, a dozen more clawed through the ventilation ducts or burst from the snow beneath the defenders' feet. The Tyranids were utilizing lictors and ravenas to bypass the kill zones, tunneling through the ice to surface behind the Imperial lines, forcing the Astartes to fight in every direction at once. While the kinetic war raged, a more insidious assault was taking place on the environmental level. The Tyranids were not merely invaders, they were a planetary pathogen. The spores raining down from orbit were not all transport vessels. Millions of microscopic mycetic spores were released into the atmosphere, drifting on the polar winds. These were phage cells and hyper-aggressive bacteria designed to strip the planet of its life-sustaining properties. The pristine, sterile air of Macragge's poles, usually crisp and thin, began to thicken with a cloying, yellowish fog. This miasma was toxic to human life. Auxilia troopers whose rebreather masks were cracked or whose seals failed began to convulse, their lungs filling with fluid as the alien spores took root in their respiratory systems. The very ice began to degrade. The heat of the battle and the corrosive blood of the dying aliens turned the glaciers into a treacherous sludge of gray slush and organic slime. The footing became unpredictable. Tanks bogged down as the permafrost melted beneath their treads, leaving them immobile targets for the crushing claws of the carnifexes. The hive mind also began to deploy weaponized flora. Spore chimneys, rapidly growing organic structures, erupted from the biomass-rich slush, pumping thick clouds of obscuring smoke and viral agents into the air. This shadow in the air mirrored the shadow in the warp, cutting off visual communication and isolating squads from one another. The battlefield became a claustrophobic nightmare where visibility was reduced to a few meters, and the only warning of an attack was the chittering of mandibles or the hiss of a scything talon cutting through the air. In the southern polar fortress, the situation was becoming critical. The sheer volume of Tyranid biomass was beginning to foul the mechanisms of the defensive guns. The barrels of the heavy bolters glowed cherry red from overheating, and the piles of alien corpses were growing so high that they blocked the firing slits of the lower bunkers. The Tyranids used this to their advantage, pushing the mounds of dead bodies forward as mobile cover, inching closer to the adamantium gates of the citadel. The adaptation of the Tyranid warrior broods posed the most significant threat to the Astartes. Initially, the Terminators' tactical dreadnought armor rendered them impervious to the standard bioweaponry of the swarm. The flesh-boar beetles shattered against the ceramite, and the scything talons glanced off the rounded shoulder pads. However, the hive mind quickly introduced the venom cannon into the fray. Wielded by the larger warrior organisms, these symbiotic weapons fired crystals coated in highly corrosive toxins at supersonic speeds. The veterans of the First Company found that their armor, capable of withstanding anti-tank missiles, was vulnerable to this specific form of chemical assault. A hit from a venom cannon would shatter upon impact, splashing the armor with acid that hissed and bubbled, eating through the ceramite layers in seconds to reach the flesh beneath. The first Terminator fell not to brute force, but to a concentrated volley of these toxins, his armor compromised and his body dissolved from within. The loss of a single veteran was a tragedy. The loss of a squad was a strategic disaster. The invincibility of the First Company was shattered, proving that on the ground, just as in the void, the Tyranids had an answer for every technological advantage the Imperium possessed. Despite the mounting casualties and the environmental collapse, the defenders held the primary objective. The massive surface-to-orbit laser batteries continued to fire. Every few minutes, the ground would shake as the capacitors discharged, sending a lance of pure energy screaming into the sky. These beams were the heartbeat of the defense, the only thing preventing the main Hive Fleet from descending into low orbit. The Tyranids knew this. The attacks intensified, focusing with maniacal precision on the generator housings and the cooling towers of the laser arrays. The Screamer Killers, now supported by zoanthropes, floating, bulbous-headed psychers that acted as conduits for the hive mind's power, began to bombard the fortress walls with blasts of warp energy. The zoanthropes unleashed lances of psychic lightning that bypassed physical armor entirely, boiling the brains of the auxilia gunners inside their bunkers and cracking the ferrocrete bastions. The psychic scream of the hive mind was so potent at close range that it caused nosebleeds and migraines among the unaugmented humans, degrading their combat efficiency and driving many to the brink of insanity. Amidst this chaos, the First Company began to execute a fighting withdrawal from the outer perimeter to the inner sanctum of the fortresses. This was not a retreat born of fear, but a calculated contraction of the defensive line to maximize the density of their fire. They abandoned the outer trench lines, which were now choked with alien bodies and toxic sludge, and fell back to the kill steps, the terraced entryways to the subterranean levels of the polar citadels. Here, the narrow confines forced the Tyranids to funnel into tight choke points, negating their numerical advantage. The Battle of Macragge had become a war of attrition in the truest sense. There was no maneuvering, no flanking, and no strategy other than survival. The Ultramarines were trading bolter shells for alien lives at a ratio of thousands to one, yet the ammunition counters were ticking down, and the enemy reserves were effectively infinite. The sky remained black with falling spores, a relentless rain of reinforcements that ensured the pressure on the gates never wavered for a single second. The consumption of the planet had not fully begun, the capillary towers had not yet risen, but the desecration was well underway. The white purity of Macragge's poles was gone, replaced by the red and black of blood and chitin, a grim foreshadowing of the fate that awaited the rest of the world if the lasers fell. While the skies above the polar regions burned with the fury of ray entry, and the ice fields turned into slaughterhouses, a separate and equally critical theater of war opened along the jagged spine of the industrial sector known as Cold Steel Ridge. This location was not merely a geographical feature, but the logistical artery of the Northern Hemisphere. It was a vast, elevated manufacturing district composed of hardened plasteel foundries, promethium refineries, and maglev transit lines that snaked through the mountains. These facilities were the primary source of ammunition and fuel for the Northern Polar Fortress. Without the continuous output of the ridge's manufactorums, the guns of the Polar Citadel would run dry within days, silencing the defense lasers and dooming the planet. Marnius Calgar recognized the existential necessity of holding this ground. Leaving the direct oversight of the Fortress of Hera to his subordinates, the chapter master took personal command of the defense at Cold Steel Ridge. He deployed the Second Company, the Guardians of the Temple, alongside heavy armor elements and titans from the Legio Praetor. The terrain favored the defenders. The ridge was a natural choke point, a labyrinth of canyons and industrial precipices that forced any attacking force to funnel into pre-registered kill zones. For the first phase of the engagement, the strategy held. The Tyranids threw waves of gaunts and warriors against the ridge, only to be shredded by the disciplined volleys of the Ultramarines and the earth-shaking barrages of the whirlwind artillery tanks positioned on the high peaks. However, the nature of the assault changed abruptly with the arrival of a new threat, an entity that the Imperium had never encountered before. Until this moment, the Tyranid swarm had acted with a ferocious, animalistic cunning, direct, brutal, and overwhelming. But as the third day of fighting on the ridge commenced, the tactical behavior of the Xenos shifted. The mindless frontal assault ceased. The swarms pulled back, disappearing into the smog-choked valleys below the ridge. Silence fell over the industrial ruins, a heavy, expectant pause that unnerved the veteran sergeants more than the roar of battle. When the attack resumed, it did not come as a wave, but as a scalpel. The Hive Mind had deployed its supreme strategic conduit, the Swarm Lord. This was not a standard Hive tyrant, but a unique bioform, the pinnacle of the Tyranid evolution of command. It possessed the accumulated tactical experience of consuming 1,000 galaxies, a creature that did not just direct the swarm, but manipulated the battlefield itself. Under its direction, the Tyranids began to dismantle the Imperial defense with terrifying precision. Instead of charging the heavy bolter emplacements, lictors and genestealers infiltrated the subterranean maintenance tunnels of the manufactorums, bypassing the front lines entirely to strike at the ammunition depots and generatoriums in the rear. Hormagaunts were used not as shock troops, but as decoys, feinting attacks on the left flank to draw the Ultramarines' reserves, while heavy Carnifex broods smashed through the weakened right flank. The Swarmlord exploited the rigid adherence to the Codex Astartes that defined the Ultramarines' doctrine. It anticipated their firing arcs, timed their reload cycles, and predicted their counter charges. For the first time in millennia, the Sons of Guilliman found themselves outmaneuvered not by superior numbers, but by superior generalship. The cohesion of the Imperial line began to fracture. Squads were isolated, cut off from the command network by localized synaptic jamming. Supply convoys carrying vital promethium to the front were ambushed by ravenas erupting from the rockcrete beneath the maglev tracks. The industrial complex of Cold Steel Ridge, once a fortress of industry, became a trap. The air filled with the panicked vox chatter of auxilia units being overrun, their coordinates lost in the smog and the shadow. Realizing that the defensive line was collapsing, Marnius Calgar sought to decapitate the enemy leadership. He identified the nexus of the alien assault, a towering figure stalking through the ruins of a promethium refinery, surrounded by a phalanx of tyrant guard. The Swarmlord stood nearly twice the height of a space marine, a four-armed nightmare clad in chitin as dense as adamantium. In its hands, it wielded four bone sabers, crystalline growths that crackled with psychic energy, capable of slicing through tank armor. Calgar, accompanied by his elite honor guard, warriors hand-picked from the First Company, and equipped with the finest artificer armor and relic weaponry in the chapter's armory, charged into the fray. The chapter master sought to break the will of the swarm by slaying its general. He fired the gauntlets of Ultramar, the twin bolters integrated into his power fists barking a staccato rhythm of death. The mass reactive shells struck the Swarmlord, exploding against its ribcage and head, but the creature did not fall. Its regenerative capabilities were instantaneous, knitting flesh and chitin back together even as it advanced. The duel that ensued was a collision of titans. Calgar met the beast amidst the wreckage of a burning manufactorum. He struck with the force of a thunderbolt, his power fists wreathed in disruption fields, aiming to crush the alien's skull. The Swarmlord parried with a speed that belied its massive bulk. The bone sabers moved in a blur, deflecting the blows of the chapter master and riposting with strikes that tested the integrity of Calgar's own armor, the armor of Antilachus. This was not a mindless beast flailing in rage. It was a duel of swordsmanship, where the alien anticipated Calgar's moves before he made them. the Swarmlord utilized its forearms to overwhelm Calgar's defenses. While two blades locked the chapter master's gauntlets, the other two struck low and high. One of the crystalline swords shore through the ceramite greaves of Calgar's leg, severing muscle and grinding against bone. Another plunged into his side, piercing the fused plasteel plates and puncturing both hearts. The Lord of Macragge, a warrior who had stood against demon princes and orc warlords, was brought to his knees. The Swarmlord did not pause to gloat. It raised its upper blades for a decapitating strike, intent on ending the command of the Ultramarines in a single stroke. It was the honor guard that prevented the death of their lord. Seeing their master fall, the elite veterans abandoned all regard for their own survival. They threw themselves between the Swarmlord and the prone body of Calgar. This was not a tactical formation, it was a wall of bodies. Aloysius, the chapter champion, led the countercharge, his power sword clashing against the bone sabers of the beast. The Tyrant Guard, massive bio-constructs bred to shield their master, intercepted the Space Marines, and the melee descended into a brutal, grinding slaughter. The Honor Guard died to buy seconds. They were torn apart by scything talons, crushed by the shields of the Tyrant Guard, and bisected by the Swarmlord's blades. But their sacrifice created a momentary opening. A Thunderhawk gunship, the Herald of Ultramar, screamed down from the smoke-filled sky, its heavy bolters churning the ground around the duel into mud and gore. The assault ramp dropped while the craft was still hovering, and the surviving members of the command squad dragged the broken, bleeding form of Marnius Calgar onto the deck. As the Thunderhawk banked hard to escape the anti-air bio-spores filling the air, the survivors looked back at the ridge. The Swarmlord stood atop a pile of Astartes corpses, roaring its triumph to the sky. The psychological blow was devastating. The chapter master was incapacitated, his body ravaged, his survival uncertain. The honor guard was decimated. The tactical acumen of the Ultramarines had been bested. With Calgar evacuated and the command structure in disarray, the order was given to abandon Cold Steel Ridge. This was a bitter pill for the Ultramarines, a chapter whose history was defined by the refusal to yield ground. But the logic of the situation was undeniable. The ridge was lost. To stay was to die in detail, surrounded and butchered by an enemy that controlled the battlefield. The retreat was sounded. The withdrawal was executed with the grim professionalism characteristic of the 13th Legion. Dreadnoughts stayed behind to form rearguard actions, their assault cannons spinning hot as they held the choke points to allow the infantry transports to pull back. Tech Marines rigged the remaining manufactorums and promethium lines with melta charges, detonating the industrial heart of the ridge as they left. If the Tyranids wanted the ridge, they would inherit a burning wasteland of twisted metal, denying them the biomass and cover the complex offered. The surviving forces of the Second Company and the Auxilia fell back toward the northern polar fortress. The loss of Cold Steel Ridge meant that the supply lines were severed. The fortress was now isolated, cut off from the rest of the planet. They had the ammunition currently in their magazines and the fuel in their reserve tanks, and nothing more. The retreat consolidated the Imperial forces, shrinking the defensive perimeter to the immediate vicinity of the polar citadels. The battle had transitioned from a planetary defense to a siege. The Swarmlord, having broken the back of the Imperial resistance in the industrial zone, now turned its gaze north, marshalling the endless tide of the Hive Fleet for the final assault on the guns that kept the Void ships at bay. The defenders of Macragge dug in, knowing that there was no longer anywhere to run. The war would be decided on the ice. With the strategic withdrawal from Cold Steel Ridge and the evacuation of the critically wounded chapter master Marnius Calgar to the fortress of Hera, the defensive geography of Macragge contracted violently. The sprawling, planet-wide engagement that had characterized the early hours of the invasion dissolved. In its place, two singular points of resistance emerged, isolated by thousands of kilometers of hostile, snow-swept wilderness and a choking atmosphere of alien spores. These were the northern and southern polar fortresses. The survival of the Ultramarines, homeworld now, depended entirely on the ability of these two citadels to remain operational. As long as their massive silo housed defense lasers continued to puncture the upper atmosphere, the main body of Hive Fleet Behemoth could not achieve a stable low orbit. If the guns fell, the void shields of the planet would be overwhelmed by saturation bombardment, and the consumption of Macragge would become an inevitability. The disposition of the Imperial forces reflected the desperate nature of this binary defense. The elite First Company, the veterans of the chapter, was bifurcated. These warriors, the finest humanity could muster, were split into two distinct task forces. Half of the company, equipped almost exclusively with tactical dreadnought armor, deployed to the southern fortress. The other half, including the company's standard bearers and the bulk of its heavy weapon specialists, dug in at the northern fortress. They were supported by the remnants of the Ultramar Defense Auxilia, regiments that had been battered during the initial landings, but now found a grim resolve in the face of annihilation. The strategy was no longer one of maneuver or counter-attack. It was a static defense of the most brutal kind. The orders were absolute: hold the lasers until the fleet was destroyed or until the last man fell. The assault on the polar fortresses began not with a charge, but with a siege that defied conventional military logic. The hive mind, having tested the perimeter defenses during the initial spore fall, adapted its strategy to bypass the formidable walls and void shields that protected the surface installations. The sensors of the northern fortress began to register seismic anomalies deep within the glacial bedrock, tremors that did not match the tectonic profile of the region. These were rhythmic, grinding vibrations that grew in intensity with each passing hour. The Tyranids were tunneling. The ice surrounding the ferrocrete foundations of the fortresses erupted as trigons, massive, serpentine bioconstructs, burst from the ground. These creatures, armored in chitin thick enough to deflect autocannon fire, had burrowed through kilometers of ice and rock, creating subterranean highways for the lesser organisms of the swarm. As the trigons surfaced, their bioelectric fields crackling with green lightning, they were followed by a torrent of hormagaunts and genestealers that poured from the tunnels like pressurized water. The attack came from within the defensive perimeter, forcing the Ultramarines to fight in the courtyards and generator rooms of the fortresses themselves. The close-quarters combat that ensued was catastrophic. In the confined spaces of the loading bays and ammunition lifts, the range advantage of the Imperial bolters was negated. Terminators, their storm bolters cycling furiously, formed walls of ceramite and plasteel, physically blocking the corridors with their bulk. Power fists and chain fists tore through the carapaces of the trigons, showering the pristine white corridors with acidic ichor. The Auxilia, lacking the heavy armor of the Astartes, were butchered in the thousands, their flak armor offering no protection against the scything talons of the tunneling beasts. Yet, even as the interiors ran red with blood, the defenders held the choke points, turning the tunnels into meat grinders that stalled the subterranean advance. Simultaneously, the surface walls faced a bombardment of living artillery. Biovores, entrenched in the ridges of ice overlooking the fortresses, launched spore mines that drifted over the battlements. These floating bombs did not rely on kinetic impact. They detonated upon sensing the proximity of non-Tyranid life, releasing clouds of corrosive gas and shrapnel made of bone. The acid ate into the rockcrete of the walls, softening the defenses for the arrival of the true siege breakers. From the swirling blizzards and spore fog emerged the Hierophant Biotitans. These were organisms of such immense scale that they rivaled the god machines of the Mechanicum. Standing on four spindly, chitin-armored legs that ended in hooks capable of impaling tanks, the Hierophant strode through the deep snow drifts with terrifying speed. Their bellies were ribbed with spore cysts, and their primary limbs were fused into massive biocannons that fired globs of venom, an acid capable of melting a Lehman Russ battle tank into slag in seconds. They did not slow for the trench lines or the razor wire. They simply stepped over them, their towering forms casting long shadows over the defenders on the walls. To meet this threat, the Legio Praetor walked. The Fire Lords, sworn defenders of Ultramar, had deployed their maniples to the polar regions to provide the heavy fire support that the Astartes could not. In the freezing winds of the poles, the void shields of the Warlord and Reaver Titans shimmered like auroras. The engagement between the Legio Praetor and the Tyranid Biotitans was a clash of eras, the technological pinnacle of the dark age of technology against the apex of biological evolution. A Warlord Titan, the Enorum, anchored the western approach to the southern fortress. Its reactor core burned with the fury of a contained star as it leveled its volcano cannon at an approaching Hierophant. The beam of coherent laser energy vaporized the falling snow instantly, striking the bio-titan in the thorax. Chitin shattered and boiled, but the beast did not fall. Its regenerative processes, fueled by a metabolism running at breakneck speed, began to knit the wound even as it returned fire. The Hierophant's biocannons unleashed a torrent of acidic sludge that splashed against the Anorum's void shields. The energy barriers flared violet and collapsed under the sustained chemical assault, allowing the acid to eat into the Titan's knee joints. The battle descended into a brawl. Reaver Titans, usually employed for flanking and support, were forced to engage the Hierophants at point-blank range. Chainfists the size of Hab blocks roared as they sawed through the organic armor of the Tyranid monsters. In return, the Hierophants lashed out with lash whips and massive claws, tearing away layers of adamantium plating and exposing the vulnerable internal mechanics of the Imperial engines. The ground shook with the impact of falling giants. When a Titan died, it died with a nuclear scream as its reactor breached. When a Hierophant died, it collapsed into a heap of dissolving biomass that released toxic spores, poisoning the battlefield for kilometers around. The situation at the northern polar fortress was rapidly deteriorating into a nightmare scenario. While the southern fortress faced a heavy assault, the hive mind seemed to have identified the north as the weaker link, or perhaps simply the pivot point upon which the invasion turned. The density of the biomass attacking the north was significantly higher. The spore clouds here were so thick that day was indistinguishable from night. The air was a toxic soup of viral agents that clogged the intake filters of the fortress's ventilation systems, forcing the defenders to fight in sealed suits or rely on their transhuman physiology to filter out the poisons. The northern fortress was effectively cut off. The retreat from Cold Steel Ridge had brought survivors to its gates, but it had also brought the attention of the swarm that had overrun the industrial sector. The supply lines were severed. There were no land trains arriving with fresh ammunition, no fuel tankers to replenish the generatoriums. The defenders were fighting with what they had in their magazines. Every bolt shell fired was one less remaining. Every power cell drained was irreplaceable. The logistical reality of the siege began to weigh as heavily as the physical attacks. The Tyranids, sensing the isolation, intensified the pressure. They utilized the biomass of their own dead to bridge the defensive moats. Millions of gaunt corpses were piled into the deep trenches surrounding the fortress walls, creating ramps of flesh that allowed the heavier warrior beasts to scale the fortifications. The Ultramarines' First Company veterans manning the walls found themselves firing directly down into a sea of upturned, hissing faces. The barrels of their assault cannons glowed cherry red, the metal threatening to warp from the heat of sustained fire. Captain Saul Invictus, commanding the First Company element at the north, organized a rotating firing line. As one squad of Terminators fell back to reload and let their weapons cool, another stepped forward to maintain the wall of fire. It was a display of discipline that only the Astartes could perform, a perfect, rhythmic cycle of violence that maximized the efficiency of every round. But for every 1,000 Tyranids they killed, 10,000 more surged forward. The ammunition counters in their retinal displays ticked down relentlessly. The sheer ferocity of the assault on the north forced the Legio Praetor Titans stationed there to adopt suicidal tactics. A pair of warhounds, the scout Titans usually reliant on speed, were cornered by a pack of Carnifexes led by a Dominatrix, a massive synaptic node beast that coordinated the local swarm. With no room to maneuver, the warhounds overloaded their plasma blast guns, firing on maximum charge until their weapon coils fused. They sacrificed themselves to hold a breach in the outer wall, their detonations taking hundreds of heavy Tyranid organisms with them. Inside the command sanctum of the northern fortress, the tech priests and servitors monitoring the defense lasers worked in a frenzy. The generators were running at 110% capacity, the cooling systems struggling to cope with the heat generated by the continuous firing cycle. Every discharge of the lasers sent a tremor through the entire facility, shaking dust from the ceiling and rattling the teeth of the defenders. The hive mind targeted these firing cycles. Between the pulses of the lasers, winged Harridans swooped down from the upper atmosphere to rake the silo doors with bio-cannon fire, attempting to damage the opening mechanisms and trap the guns inside their housings. The defenders on the roof of the fortress fought a vertical battle against these airborne horrors. Assault Marines, their jump packs screaming in the thin polar air, launched themselves at the Tyranids, engaging in aerial duels amidst the smoke and laser fire. They used chainswords and meltabombs to clip the wings of the great beasts, sending them crashing onto the ice below. It was a chaotic, three-dimensional melee where death could come from any angle. As the siege dragged into its third standard day, the isolation of the northern fortress became absolute. The Vox channels were drowned out by the psychic scream of the shadow in the warp, which had reached a fever pitch. No distress signals could get out, no orders could come in. The defenders were an island in a sea of monsters. The tactical cogitators predicted total ammunition depletion within 12 hours at current rates of fire. The First Company veterans, realizing the inevitability of the situation, began to conserve their heavy munitions for the largest targets, resorting to combat knives and the sheer weight of their Terminator armor to crush the smaller gaunts that breached the perimeter. The hive mind, detecting the weakening volume of fire, prepared its final push. The ground surrounding the northern fortress began to heave as Trigons and Molochs coordinated a massive subterranean undermining of the northern wall section. Unlike the previous probing attacks, this was a concentrated effort to collapse the primary defensive bulwark. The Ferrocrete groaned and cracked, entire sections of the battlements sliding into the earth as the foundations were chewed away. Through the dust and debris, the Swarmlord's influence manifested. Though the beast itself had been last seen at Cold Steel Ridge, its tactical imprint was unmistakable. The swarm moved with a singular, terrifying intelligence, surging through the breach not as a mob, but as a formed column of heavy shock troops, Tyrant Guard, Carnifexes, and Tyranid warriors, shielded by a psychic dome projected by a choir of zoanthropes. The First Company Terminators moved to plug the breach. They stood amidst the rubble of the collapsed wall, the snow swirling around their massive forms. This was the anvil upon which the chapter's fate would be hammered. They did not have the numbers to push the Tyranids back, only to hold them in place. The close quarters fighting that erupted in the breach was of a savagery rarely recorded in the annals of the Imperium. Lightning claws flashed, severing limbs and heads. Thunder hammers crushed chitin and bone with deafening cracks. The Astartes fought in silence, save for the roar of their weapons and the binary blurts of their tactical comms. Behind them, the defense lasers continued to fire. The rhythm was the heartbeat of the defense: charge, fire, vent. Each beam that pierced the sky was a victory, a denial of the enemy's ultimate goal. But the cost of that rhythm was paid in the blood of the veterans holding the gap. With their ammunition dry, the Terminators fought with their gauntleted fists, bludgeoning the aliens to death. The snow around the breach turned into a slush of black ichor and Astartes red. The northern fortress was dying, but it was dying with its throat locked around the enemy, refusing to let go. The collapse of the outer wall at the northern polar fortress did not signal the end of the engagement, but rather a transition into a far darker and more brutal phase of combat. As the Ferrocrete dust settled and the wind howled through the breach, the nature of the battle shifted from a planetary siege to a claustrophobic purge. Captain Sol Invictus, recognizing that the perimeter could no longer be held against the tide of heavy bioforms surging through the gap, ordered the withdrawal of the First Company into the subterranean infrastructure of the Citadel. This was not a retreat into safety. It was a descent into a labyrinth of service tunnels, ammunition silos, and generatoriums where the tactical advantages of the Tyranid swarm, numbers and speed, would be pitted directly against the raw durability and firepower of the Terminator squads. The northern polar fortress was not merely a bunker. It was an industrial complex buried kilometers deep into the glacial ice, designed to service the massive surface-to-orbit laser battery. The corridors were wide enough to accommodate ammunition loaders and maintenance servitors, lined with thick cabling and pressurized steam pipes. It was here that the veterans of the First Company established their new kill zones. They positioned themselves at the intersections of the primary arterial hallways, turning the narrow confines into funnels of death. The lighting in these lower levels was intermittent, the main power having been diverted to the guns, leaving the Astartes to fight by the strobing red of emergency lumens and the harsh white glare of their own suit-mounted floodlights. As the Tyranid vanguard flooded into the fortress interior, the engagement distances dropped from kilometers to meters. The first wave to enter the tunnels consisted of hormagaunts and termagants, creatures that scrambled over the walls and ceilings as easily as the floor. In the open, they relied on agility. Here, they were packed so tightly that they could not dodge. The storm bolters of the Terminators roared in the confined acoustics of the tunnels, the sound amplified to a deafening thunder. Mass reactive shells did not need to be aimed with precision. They were fired into the mass of hissing flesh, detonating on impact and turning the front ranks of the aliens into a spray of gore that coated the walls and the armor of the defenders. However, the hive mind quickly adapted to the geometry of the battlefield. Realizing that the lesser gaunts were being slaughtered without inflicting casualties, the swarm deployed its shock troops. Genestealers, the apex predators of close-quarters combat, began to infiltrate the ventilation shafts and maintenance crawlspaces. These creatures, armed with diamond-hard claws capable of rending through tactical dreadnought armor, bypassed the heavy bolter fire to drop directly onto the unsuspecting squads. The fighting devolved into a chaotic melee. Terminators, their movement restricted by the bulk of their suits and the narrow corridors, were forced to rely on their power fists and chain fists. The sound of the battle changed from the staccato of gunfire to the wet tearing of meat and the screech of adamantium being sheared. A veteran sergeant, his helmet torn away by a genestealer patriarch, fought on with half his face exposed to the toxic air, crushing the alien's skull with a thunder hammer before succumbing to a dozen lacerations. The resilience of the Terminator armor was tested to its limit. Ceramic plates cracked under the pressure of crushing claws, and the internal skeletons of the suits sparked as hydraulic lines were severed. Yet, for every Astartes that fell, 100 Xenos were butchered. The first company did not give ground easily. They made the Tyranids pay for every meter of the silo complex in blood. The primary objective of the Tyranid assault was the ammunition hoists, the massive, chain-driven lifts that brought the house-sized energy cells and capacitors from the deep vaults to the laser batteries on the surface. If the Tyranids compromised the hoists, the guns would starve. Captain Invictus deployed his heavy weapons specialists to these critical junctions. Terminators wielding assault cannons spun their barrels, the weapons humming with a high-pitched whine before unleashing torrents of high-caliber rounds that disintegrated anything in their path. The rate of fire was so intense that the barrels glowed white-hot, illuminating the dark shafts with the heat of their discharge. Alongside the assault cannons, the heavy flamers proved to be the most effective weapon in the arsenal of the First Company. In the oxygen-rich environment of the lower levels, the Promethium fires burned with terrifying intensity. When the Tyranids attempted to flood a corridor, the veterans would bathe the entire hallway in liquid fire. The screeching of burning aliens echoed through the ducts, and the smell of charred chitin and cooked flesh became overpowering, filtering through the rebreathers of the surviving auxilia troops cowering in the reserve bunkers. The flamers did not just kill, they created physical barriers of heat and wreckage that the biological organisms hesitated to cross. As the hours dragged on, a grim logistical reality began to set in. The Tyranids were infinite, the ammunition was not. The storm bolters began to click dry. The assault cannons spun down, their magazines depleted. The First Company, the finest warriors of Macragge, were forced to switch to combat knives and the sheer kinetic force of their armored limbs. The corridors of the northern fortress began to clog with the dead. This was not a figure of speech. The piles of Tyranid corpses grew so high that they blocked the lines of sight. The living aliens had to scramble over mounds of their own dead to reach the defenders, slowing their advance and robbing them of their momentum. The Terminators used this to their advantage. They utilized the walls of alien dead as makeshift barricades, firing their last rounds through the gaps in the tangled limbs and ribcage. The physical density of the slaughter was such that the fortress's automated cleaning systems failed. The drainage grates choked with thick, coagulated ichor. The floor became a slick, treacherous surface where footing was impossible to maintain. The battle became a slow-motion grind, a contest of stamina where the Astartes fought with the mechanical precision of automatons, their muscles burning with lactic acid, their systems flooded with combat stimulants to keep them awake and fighting. Deep in the generatorium, a squad of Terminators equipped with Cyclone missile launchers fought a desperate action against a brood of Carnifexes that had smashed through the reinforced blast doors. The missiles, usually reserved for long-range engagement, were fired at point-blank range. The explosions shook the foundations of the fortress, rupturing steam pipes and filling the chamber with blinding white fog. In the confusion, the Astartes engaged the massive bio-beasts with chain fists, sawing through the thick legs of the Carnifexes to bring them down before finishing them with power blows to the cranium. The cost was total. The squad was wiped out, buried under the collapsing ceiling alongside their kills, but the generator remained intact for another hour. The strategic value of this sacrifice was not immediately apparent to the defenders, who knew only the immediate horror of their situation. However, in the wider context of the planetary defense, the resistance of the First Company at the northern fortress was pivotal. By forcing the hive mind to commit such a staggering density of biomass to dig them out of the tunnels, the veterans were acting as a magnet for the swarm. The hive mind, driven by the imperative to silence the gun that was hurting its fleet, poured millions of organisms into the north. This concentration of force relieved the pressure on the southern polar fortress. While the north was being overrun, the guns of the south continued to fire without interruption. The southern fortress, facing a lighter concentration of heavy bioforms, was able to repel the attacks on its perimeter. The lasers from the south continued to stab into the high orbit, vaporizing hive ships and denying the fleet the ability to stabilize its position. The Tyranids could not ignore the north to focus on the south because the northern gun, though besieged, was still firing. The crew of the northern laser, protected by the First Company's defense of the lower levels, kept the weapons cycling. Charge, fire, vent. The rhythm continued even as the slaughter raged directly beneath the gun deck. Eventually, the sheer attrition became insurmountable. The First Company was reduced to a handful of isolated pockets of resistance. Captain Invictus, surrounded by the bodies of his command squad and hundreds of dead Tyranids, held the entrance to the primary control room. His storm bolter was empty, his lightning claw shattered. He fought with a combat blade and the broken end of a banner pole, impaling a Tyranid warrior that lunged at him. The end did not come with a grand explosion, but with the silence of the gun. The Tyranids finally breached the coolant feeds for the primary laser. The weapon, deprived of its thermal regulation, executed an emergency shutdown to prevent a catastrophic reactor meltdown. The silence that fell over the northern fortress was heavier than the roar of battle. The great laser was dead. The Tyranids had achieved their objective, but the cost they had paid was astronomical. The corridors of the fortress were not just littered with bodies, they were packed solid. In some sectors, the Tyranids could physically no longer advance because the tunnels were sealed floor to ceiling with the carcasses of Gaunts and Genestealers. The First Company had not just killed the enemy, they had built a tomb out of them. The hive mind, having silenced the northern gun, attempted to redirect its forces to the south, but the biomass committed to the north was effectively spent. The creatures inside the fortress were trapped in the logjam of the dead, unable to extract themselves quickly. The heavy monsters, the Carnifexes and Tyrant Guards, were buried under tons of rubble brought down by the Terminator's final acts of sabotage. The delay caused by this consumption of resources meant that the southern fortress remained operational for the remainder of the naval engagement. The First Company of the Ultramarines died to a man in the dark, frozen bowels of the northern fortress. There were no survivors to carry the gene seed, no apothecaries left to harvest the progenides. It was a total loss of the chapter's veteran cadre, a blow that would take centuries to recover from. But as the bioships in orbit continued to burn under the fire of the southern laser, the magnitude of their achievement was written in the wreckage of the enemy fleet. They had traded their lives not for victory, but for time, the most precious commodity in a war against the great devourer. The fortress was lost, its halls silent save for the chittering of the victors feasting on the dead, but the planet still held. The sacrifice of the North had bought Macragge a chance at survival. While the tragedy of the First Company played out in the frozen dark of the northern pole, the situation in high orbit above Macragge had devolved into a slow, grinding death spiral for the Ultramarines fleet. The surviving battle barges and strike cruisers, their hulls pitted by acid and scorched by bioplasma, were no longer fighting to win, they were fighting for air. The density of the Tyranid swarm had become a physical medium, a suffocating cloud of biomass that clogged the void around the planet. The Octavius and the Caesar, the pride of the chapter's naval might, were effectively immobilized, trapped within a lattice of grappling tentacles and drifting wreckage. Their void shields had long since collapsed, and their point defense turrets were overheating as they tried to cut through the wall of flesh pressing against their viewports. The hive mind, sensing the imminent collapse of the orbital defenses, had begun to ignore the Astartes vessels, treating them as obstacles rather than threats. The massive hive ships, the reproductive hearts of the fleet, were pushing past the blockade, utilizing the momentum of millions of sacrificial drone ships to inch closer to the optimal synchronous orbit required for the final consumption of the planet. The remaining orbital defense platforms of the Starnova class were silent, their crews digested, or their reactors breached. The only thing keeping the invasion from total saturation was the solitary, defiant rhythm of the Southern Polar Laser Battery, which continued to lance out from the surface, vaporizing any capital ship that drifted into its firing arc. It was into this cauldron of biological density that salvation arrived, tearing its way through the fabric of reality. At the system's Manville point, far beyond the engagement zone, the vacuum of space distorted violently. The shadow and the warp, which had smothered the Macragge system for weeks, roiled and snapped as a new force forced its way into real space. The arrival was not graceful. The translation from the Imperium was rough, a brute force entry that sent shockwaves of displacement through the ether. Battle Fleet Behemoth had arrived. This was the Tempestus fleet, the iron fist of the Imperial Navy in the Segmentum, mobilized from their anchorage and driven through the warp storms with reckless haste. Leading the formation was the Dominus Astra, an Emperor-class battleship of ancient provenance. It was a vessel of awe-inspiring scale, a flying city of Gothic spires, adamantium buttresses, and weapon batteries that stretched for kilometers along its flanks. Its prow was an armored eagle's beak the size of a mountain, designed to crush the hulls of lesser ships through sheer kinetic impact. Flanking the flagship were squadrons of Lunar-class cruisers, Dictator-class carriers, and a swarm of Cobra and Firestorm frigates, their engines burning white-hot as they accelerated toward the gravity well of Macragge. The arrival of the Tempestus fleet changed the geometric logic of the battle instantly. Until this moment, the Tyranids had faced a static enemy, the Ultramarines anchored in high orbit and the ground batteries below. Now, they were threatened from the rear. The Dominus Astra did not hail the defenders, it simply opened fire. Its dorsal lance batteries, weapons capable of cracking tectonic plates, lashed out across the void. Beams of coherent energy struck the rear echelon of Hive Fleet Behemoth, catching the bioships unaware. The impact was catastrophic for the aliens. Hive ships, their armor focused on the frontal assault against Macragge, were skewered from behind, their organic boilers rupturing in cascades of frozen fluid and crystallized blood. The Imperial Navy doctrine for engaging Tyranids differed significantly from the surgical strikes of the Astartes. The Tempestus fleet relied on massed broadsides and overwhelming volume of fire. As the fleet closed the distance, the cruisers swung their prows, bringing their port and starboard batteries to bear. A wall of macro cannon shells, each the size of a battle tank, was hurled into the dense cloud of the Tyranid swarm. The effect was that of a shotgun blast into a swarm of insects. The densely packed formation of the Hive fleet, which had been its greatest strength in overwhelming the Ultramarines, now became its greatest weakness. There was no need for precision targeting. Every shell that entered the cloud struck something. The Dominus Astra drove a wedge of high explosive death into the center of the alien formation. The sheer kinetic force of the bombardment shattered the cohesion of the Tyranid rearguard. Kraken ships and escort drones were pulverized, turning into expanding clouds of debris that the following Imperial ships used as cover. The Ultramarines' vessels, seeing the arrival of the reinforcements on their augers, rallied. The Caesar, venting plasma from its damaged drives, fired its maneuvering thrusters to pivot, adding its own bombardment cannons to the crossfire. For the first time since the invasion began, the Hive fleet was trapped. It was caught in a classic pincer movement, hammered against the anvil of Macragge's planetary defenses by the hammer of Battle Fleet Behemoth. The Southern Polar Laser continued its relentless work from below, while the Dominus Astra and its escorts tore into the swarm from above. The space between the planet and the arriving fleet became a kill box of unprecedented lethality. The void was illuminated by the constant flash of fusion warheads and the burning atmosphere of dying bio-ships. The reaction of the hive mind was immediate and terrifying in its alien pragmatism. It did not panic, for it felt no fear, but it recognized a threat to its essential biological imperatives. The Hive Fleet was not merely an army, it was a superorganism, and deep within the protected core of the swarm drifted the Norn Queens. These immense, bloated bioships were the synaptic nexus of the fleet, the womb factories that birthed the endless legions of the Tyranids. If the Norn Queens were destroyed, the synaptic web would collapse, reducing the billions of warrior beasts to feral animals. The hive mind shifted its strategy from predation to preservation. The assault on Macragge's surface was momentarily deprioritized. The tendrils of the fleet that had been reaching for the planet's atmosphere retracted. The swarm turned. Millions of lesser organisms, hunter-killer drones, ether swimmers, and gargoyles were ordered to cease their attacks on the Ultramarines ships and instead form a living shield around the Norn Queens. They condensed into a solid sphere of biomass, a wall of flesh kilometers thick, designed to absorb the lance strikes of the Dominus Astra. Simultaneously, the hive mind directed its heavy combat vessels to engage the Tempestus fleet with suicidal ferocity. This was not a tactical engagement, it was a bludgeoning. Massive Razor Fiend cruisers and Void Krakens accelerated toward the Imperial line, ignoring the damage they sustained. They did not fire their bioweapons, they aimed to ram. The bridge crew of the Dominus Astra watched on their tactical hololiths as the Tyranid ships pushed their biological drives to the breaking point, hurling themselves into the path of the Imperial macro shells to intercept the fire meant for the Queens. The Void War descended into a chaotic melee. A lunar-class cruiser, the Hand of Redemption, was struck amidships by a dying hive ship that had been split in two by a lance strike. The two halves of the alien vessel clamped around the Imperial cruiser like the jaws of a trap, crushing the hull and venting its atmosphere in seconds. Firestorm frigates, darting through the debris fields to deliver torpedo runs, found themselves ensnared by clouds of drifting spore mines that detonated against their void shields, stripping them bare for the follow-up attacks of the Harridan swarms. The Dominus Astra became the focal point of the Tyranid counterattack. The hive mind recognized the Emperor-class battleship as the primary threat, the source of the devastating lance fire that was threatening the Norn Queens. It directed a stream of bioships to collide with the flagship. The Imperial vessel's void shields flared and sparked, glowing with the intensity of a small sun as they absorbed the impacts of acid, bioplasma, and the kinetic strikes of ramming escort drones. The sheer mass of the Tyranid dead began to pile up against the energy fields, creating a layer of ablative armor made of corpses that obscured the gunner's vision and fouled the sensors. Despite the fury of the Tempestus fleet's arrival, a grim realization began to settle over the command deck of the Dominus Astra. The tactical cogitators, running predictive algorithms based on the rate of biomass destruction versus the remaining density of the swarm, were returning error codes. The numbers were impossible. The Imperial fleet was destroying Tyranid ships by the thousands, vaporizing millions of tons of biological matter every hour, yet the swarm was so vast that these losses were statistically insignificant. The density of the Hive Fleet was such that conventional firepower was losing its efficacy. The macro cannon shells were detonating against the outer layers of the shield wall the hive mind had constructed, killing the ablative drones but failing to penetrate to the Norn Queens at the center. The lance batteries, while powerful, could only fire in straight lines. The Tyranids were simply moving fresh bodies into the path of the beams faster than the capacitors could recharge. It was a war of attrition where the enemy had effectively infinite resources. Worse still, the Tyranids were adapting to the naval weaponry. The bioships on the perimeter of the swarm began to secrete a dense, refractive mucus that dispersed the energy of the laser batteries, reducing the lethality of the lance strikes. They clustered together, their overlapping void shields creating a gestalt field that was harder to crack than the shields of a capital ship. The Dominus Astra was pouring enough firepower to level a continent into the void, and it was being absorbed by the sponge-like resilience of the Tyranid formation. The pincer movement, while tactically sound, was failing due to the sheer scale of the enemy. The Ultramarines fleet was too damaged to press the anvil, and the Tempestus fleet was being bogged down in the slurry of the dead. The hive mind, having secured the safety of the Norn Queens behind the wall of sacrificial ships, began to push the mass toward the planet again. The momentum of the swarm was irresistible. Like a glacier, it moved slowly but with crushing weight, pushing the debris and the Imperial ships aside. Behemoth was willing to lose 90% of its bioships if it meant placing the Norn Queens in low orbit. Once there, they would drop their capillary towers, and the consumption of Macragge would become irreversible. On the bridge of the Dominus Astra, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and incense. Officers shouted coordinates to the gunnery decks, and servitors merged with the ship's cogitators spasmed as the data streams overwhelmed their organic processors. The view from the armored bridge windows was a nightmare of writhing motion. The stars were gone, replaced by the endless, shifting carapace of the Great Devourer. The ship shuddered violently as a massive tentacle from a passing hive ship whipped against the void shields, the impact registering as a hull stress fracture on decks 12 through 15. The realization was stark. They could not shoot their way out of this. The density of the Tyranid fleet meant that for every ship destroyed, the wreckage itself became a weapon, a drifting obstacle that shielded the next wave. The fog of war had become a solid wall. The Dominus Astra and her escorts were firing into a mountain of flesh that regenerated faster than it could be eroded. The Norn Queens remained out of reach, protected by kilometers of living ablative armor. If the battle continued as a conventional exchange of fire, the Imperial Navy would run out of ammunition before the Tyranids ran out of bodies. The math was cold and absolute. The Hive Fleet would absorb the punishment, grind the Tempestus fleet into scrap through sheer weight of numbers, and then descend upon Macragge. The sacrifice of the First Company at the North Pole, the defense of the Southern Laser, the weeks of holding the line, it would all be for nothing. The conventional war was lost. The realization rippled through the fleet command not as a message of defeat, but as a clarity of purpose. To break the beast, they would have to stop trying to kill it piece by piece and instead strike a blow that biology could not adapt to. The Dominus Astra, the Lord of the Stars, was the largest weapon in the system, but its guns were no longer enough. The ship itself would have to become the instrument of deliverance. The tactical cogitators on the bridge of the Dominus Astra had ceased to offer solutions. The data streams scrolling across the command lecterns presented a mathematical certainty of defeat. The biomass of Hive Fleet Behemoth was regenerating faster than the macro batteries of the Tempestus fleet could incinerate it. The Lord Admiral, commanding from the center of the sensory web, recognized that the conventional rules of naval warfare no longer applied. To continue the exchange of broadsides was to accept a slow, grinding death that would inevitably result in the fall of Macragge. The Norn Queens, the massive bioships coordinating the swarm, remained insulated behind a spherical wall of ablative organisms, kilometers thick, that absorbed lance strikes and torpedo volleys with maddening resilience. The order was given to disengage safety interlocks on the main plasma drives. The Dominus Astra, a vessel the size of a hive city, began to accelerate. It did not turn away from the enemy. It drove directly into the heart of the Tyranid formation. The Emperor-class battleship, its prow armored with meters of reinforced adamantium, became a kinetic missile of astronomical proportions. Escort cruisers and frigates broke formation to clear a path, unleashing a final, desperate barrage of torpedoes to soften the outer crust of the Tyranid shield wall. The flagship shuddered as it plowed through the wreckage of destroyed bioships and the living bodies of void whales, its void shields collapsing under the impact of millions of tons of biological matter. As the Dominus Astra pierced the outer perimeter of the swarm's defensive sphere, the hull began to buckle. Tyranid feeder tentacles and boarding tubes slammed into the flanks of the ship, tearing open decks and exposing the crew to the vacuum. The bridge crew ignored the hull breach warnings screaming from every sector. They were not aiming to engage the Norn Queens with guns. The target coordinates were locked onto the center of the gravimetric disturbance caused by the massive cluster of hive ships. The ship was deep within the gravity well of the Macragge system, a zone where the activation of warp drives was strictly forbidden by every navigational codex in the Imperium due to the catastrophic instability it caused in the fabric of reality. With the Norn Queens filling the forward viewports, blotting out the stars with their pulsating, organic bulk, the Lord Admiral authorized the activation of the warp engines. The Geller field generators remained offline. This was not a translation into the Immaterium for travel. It was a weaponization of the transition itself. The ancient warp drives of the Dominus Astra spooled up in seconds, drawing power directly from the overloading plasma reactors. The fabric of real space around the battleship did not shimmer, it tore. The detonation of a warp drive within a gravity well did not produce a conventional explosion. It created a vortex, a localized, violent rupture between the material universe and the warp. A rift opened where the Dominus Astra stood, a gaping maw of swirling, multicolored madness that defied the laws of physics. The battleship was instantly unmade, its matter scattered across dimensions, but the effect of its sacrifice was cataclysmic. The vortex expanded outward with terrifying velocity, a gravity shear that ignored mass and armor. The heart of Hive Fleet Behemoth was dragged screaming into the Empyrean. The Norn Queens, too massive to maneuver and caught in the immediate pull of the rift, were stretched and distorted. Their organic hulls, evolved to withstand the cold of space and the heat of stars, crumbled under the impossible stresses of the warp breach. One moment, the central cluster of the fleet was a dense ball of apex predators. The next, it was gone, sucked into the non-reality of the warp, along with millions of escort drones in warrior forms. The vortex raged for a few seconds, a blinding eye of terror in the blackness of the void, before collapsing in on itself with a shockwave that scattered the remaining outer layers of the swarm like dust in a gale. The immediate effect on the Tyranid organism was absolute. The synaptic web, the invisible psychic network that bound billions of individual creatures into a single, cohesive consciousness, was severed at the source. The backlash was not merely a loss of signal, it was a psychic feedback loop of devastating intensity. Across the orbital sphere, the remaining bioships went into spasms. Without the guiding will of the Norn Queens and the hive mind, the massive Leviathans forgot their purpose. Some drifted listlessly, their weapon batteries falling silent. Others, driven by basic, uncoordinated instincts, turned upon one another, lashing out with tentacles and acid in a mindless frenzy of self-destruction. The disciplined, impenetrable blockade that had strangled Macragge dissolved into a chaotic soup of confused beasts. On the surface of Macragge, the impact of the synaptic severance was even more visceral. At the southern polar fortress, where the defenders were fighting back-to-back against the encroaching tide, the change in the enemy was instantaneous. The larger synapse creatures, the Tyranid warriors, the zoanthropes, and the towering hive tyrants were the conduits of the hive mind's will. When the link was shattered, their brains were overloaded by the psychic trauma. Ultramarines on the battlements watched as Tyranid warriors in the midst of combat suddenly halted, dropping their weapons to claw at their own skulls. Cranial plates burst open, spraying ichor as the creatures suffered massive cerebral hemorrhages. Zoanthropes, floating above the battlefield, fell from the sky like stones, their bulbous heads rupturing from the uncontained psychic energy. The Swarmlord, or the fragments of its consciousness that directed the assault, vanished from the field, its physical vessels rendered inert or dead. The lesser organisms, the millions of hormigants, termagants, and gargoyles, did not die, but they were stripped of the intellect that made them a planetary threat. Deprived of the synapse, they reverted to their base biological coding. The unified flowing river of chitin that had moved with tactical precision disintegrated into a mob of feral animals. They no longer coordinated their attacks or utilized cover. They stopped targeting the laser batteries and shield generators. Instead, they attacked whatever was closest, whether it was an Imperial tank, a rock, or another Tyranid. The terrifying silence of the disciplined swarm was replaced by the confused shrieking of a billion wild beasts. The defenders of the southern fortress, initially stunned by the sudden cessation of the coordinated assault, seized the initiative. The surviving titans of the Legio Praetor, their void shields flickering and ammunition nearly depleted, strode forward into the disorganized masses. Vulcan mega-bolters roared, cutting swathes through the confused gaunts that milled about the ice fields. The Ultramarines, recognizing that the tactical acumen of the enemy was gone, launched immediate counter-assaults. Terminators waded into the fray, their storm bolters and power fists making short work of creatures that now fought with no more strategy than cornered rats. The threat to the orbital defense lasers had ended. The guns of the southern fortress continued to fire, but now they targeted a fleet that could not dodge or retaliate. The skies above Macragge, once choked with spores and drop pods, cleared as the atmospheric injection of biomass ceased. The remaining bioships in orbit were systematically hunted down by the remnants of the Ultramarines fleet and the survivors of the Tempestus battle group. It was no longer a battle, it was an execution. The surviving Imperial ships moved through the debris fields, pouring broadsides into the drifting hulks of the Tyranid vessels, ensuring that no potential for regeneration remained. However, the victory in the void did not mean the war on the surface was over. The destruction of the Hive Fleet left millions of Tyranid organisms stranded on Macragge. While they lacked the coordination to destroy the planet or consume its biosphere efficiently, they remained lethal biological killing machines. The scouring of Macragge began the moment the orbital guns fell silent. It was a campaign of extermination that would last for months, a grim and muddy business of rooting out nests of feral aliens from the glaciers, the mountains, and the ruins of the industrial sectors. The Ultramarines, their numbers severely depleted, mobilized every surviving auxiliary soldier and weapon system for this task. Hunter-killer teams swept the polar wastelands, using flamers and promethium to burn out the deep tunnels where the Tyranids had dug in. Without the hive mind to direct them, the Tyranids did not consolidate their forces. They scattered, hiding in the deep crevasses and dark places of the world, emerging only to feed. The fighting was sporadic but brutal. Patrols would vanish in the night, dragged under the ice by lictors that had survived the synaptic shock, or ambushed by packs of ravenas acting on predatory instinct. The most harrowing phase of the scouring occurred at the northern polar fortress. When the relief forces from the south finally broke through to the northern pole, they found a silence that was absolute. The fortress itself was a ruin, its walls breached and its interior choked with the dead. The excavation of the lower levels took weeks. The sheer volume of Tyranid corpses blocking the corridors required heavy earth-moving equipment to clear. It was here, in the frozen dark of the generatoriums and ammunition silos, that the full cost of the victory was revealed. The first company of the Ultramarines was found where they had fallen. They were not in a single mass, but arranged in defensive rings at every major tactical junction of the fortress. They lay atop mounds of slain enemies, their armor rent and shattered, their ammunition magazines empty. In the primary control room of the laser battery, the body of Captain Saul Invictus was discovered. He was surrounded by the carcasses of high-level bioforms, his combat knife buried in the skull of a Tyranid warrior. There were no survivors. The veterans had held the line until the very end, ensuring that the hive mind was forced to commit its reserves to the north, buying the time necessary for the Dominus Astra to arrive. The recovery of the first company's gene seed became the primary focus of the chapter's apothecaries. It was a somber task performed in the freezing cold, extracting the progenitor glands from warriors who had served the chapter for centuries. The loss of the first company was a wound to the soul of the Ultramarines that would take generations to heal. The Terminator suits, damaged beyond repair, were recovered as relics, their machine spirits honored for their service. The banner of the first company, torn and stained with alien ichor, was raised once more, not in triumph, but in solemn remembrance. As the weeks passed, the scouring pushed the feral Tyranids further into the uninhabited wilds of Macragge. The Auxilia used massive seismic hammers to collapse the tunnel networks the Trigons had bored, sealing the creatures underground. Forests that showed signs of hypergrowth or mycetic infection were burned to the ground to prevent the alien flora from taking root. The atmosphere, slowly filtering out the toxins and spores, began to return to its natural composition, though the skies remained a hazy gray from the smoke of the funeral pyres. The Battle of Macragge had been won, but the planet was scarred. The polar caps, once pristine white, were stained with vast swathes of black and purple fluids that would take years to wash away. The industrial capacity of the world was crippled, with cold steel ridge reduced to twisted slag. The orbital grid was a graveyard of ships, both Imperial and Tyranid, creating a debris ring that would pose a navigational hazard for centuries. Yet, the strategic outcome was undeniable. Hive Fleet Behemoth, the unstoppable juggernaut that had consumed Tyran Primus and Prandium, was dead. Its heart had been torn out by the sacrifice of the Dominus Astra, and its body had been broken on the anvil of the polar fortresses. The Imperium had proven that the Great Devourer could be stopped, but the price of that proof was the near annihilation of the Ultramarines chapter. The survivors stood amidst the wreckage of their home, looking up at the stars where the rift had closed, knowing that while the beast was slain, the galaxy had become a darker, more dangerous place. The silence that followed the war was not one of peace, but of exhaustion, a quiet interrupted only by the bolter shots of the cleanup crews finishing the work the first company had started. The wind howling across the jagged ice fields of the northern polar cap carried the stench of death long before the relief columns sighted the fortress. It was a heavy, copper-tasting gale, thick with the particulates of frozen blood and the lingering chemical bite of dissolved armor. Marnius Calgar, Lord of Macragge, sat within the command transport of the lead land raider, his body a broken landscape of sutured flesh and reinforced bionics following his duel with the Swarmlord. The pain was a dull, constant thrum beneath the cocktail of stimulants and analgesics administered by the apothecaries, but it was secondary to the hollow dread settling in his gut. The orbital Vox traffic had confirmed the victory in the void, and the southern guns were silent but secure, yet from the north there had been no signal, no encrypted burst of confirmation, only the static hiss of a dead channel. The approach to the northern polar fortress was a navigation through a graveyard of geological proportions. The glaciers, once pristine white sheets of ice that had stood for millions of years, were now stained a deep, bruising purple and black. The landscape had been reshaped not by tectonic forces, but by the accumulation of biomass. The tracks of the land raiders crunched over mounds of frozen Tyranid husks that rose like dunes, stretching from the horizon to the fortress walls. These were not scattered corpses. They were a pavement of dead organisms, layers deep, compacted by the weight of the millions that had climbed over them. Gaunts, termagants, and gargoyles lay entangled in a frozen tapestry of limbs and tails, their chitinous carapaces dusted with the gray ash falling from the burning atmospheric scrubbers. As the relief force breached the outer perimeter, the scale of the siege became horrifyingly apparent. The ferrocrete walls of the citadel, meters thick and reinforced with void-hardened plasteel, had not been breached by laser fire or explosives, but by teeth and claws. The ramparts were eroded, chewed away by the relentless gnawing of the swarm. In the dry moats, the bodies of carnifexes and siege beasts lay piled so high that they formed organic ramps reaching the parapets, their massive crushing claws still embedded in the stone they had sought to tear down. There was no movement among the dead, only the flapping of tattered banners in the wind and the groan of settling ice. The main gates of the fortress were gone, twisted off their hinges and buried under a landslide of rubble and Xenos bodies. Calgar ordered the column to halt. The interior of the fortress was too choked with debris for the heavy armor to navigate. The survivors of the Second Company, along with the remaining honor guard and squads of scouts, disembarked. They moved into the breach on foot, bolters raised, their helmet lumens cutting through the gloom. The silence inside the walls was absolute. It was not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating stillness of a tomb where even the ghosts had been devoured. The courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Here the snow was not white, but red, a frozen slurry of Astartes' blood mixed with the ichor of the alien. The wreckage of Rhino transports and Predator tanks lay overturned, their hulls ripped open like tin cans, the crews missing or reduced to bone. But it was the Tyranid dead that dominated the space. They were packed so tightly that the floor was invisible. The Ultramarines had to climb over the carcasses of Tyranid warriors and Ravena broods to reach the inner sanctum. Every step was a struggle against the tangled geometry of alien anatomy. The descent into the subterranean levels of the fortress marked a transition into a nightmare. The air filtration systems had failed days ago, leaving the atmosphere heavy with the toxic miasma of the Tyranid biological agents and the soot of Prometheum fires. The lumens flickered and died, forcing the Astartes to rely on their auto-senses and thermal imaging. The heat signatures were cold. There was no life here. The corridors, designed to accommodate the movement of ammunition loaders and maintenance servitors, were now choke points of unimaginable violence. The walls were scored with deep gouges from scything talons and pitted by the acidic splash of bioplasma. Shell casings from storm bolters lay in drifts against the bulkheads, thousands of brass cylinders that crunched under the ceramite boots of the search party. As they moved deeper toward the generatoriums and the ammunition hoists for the great orbital lasers, the nature of the enemy dead changed. The carpet of lesser gaunts gave way to the heavy shock troops of the Hive Fleet. Here lay the carcasses of genestealers, their limbs tangled in death, and the massive, armored hulks of Tyrant Guard, their carapaces cracked by thunder hammers and power fists. It was in the primary generatorium, a cavernous hall dominated by the hum of the cooling reactors which had miraculously kept cycling until the fuel ran dry, that Calgar found his veterans. The blast doors to the chamber had been torn down, not from the outside, but blown outward, likely by the defenders to create a final kill zone. Inside, the scene defied the analytical logic of the post-battle Auspex scans. It was a tableau of martial perfection frozen in the moment of ultimate sacrifice. The first company of the Ultramarines, the elite warriors who had marched across the stars to bring the Emperor's light to the darkness, were all dead. Not a single battle brother drew breath, but they had not died fleeing, nor had they died in disarray. They were found arranged in defensive circles around the critical control junctions and the ammunition lifts. They lay back to back, their armor locked together to form walls of ceramite against the tide. The condition of the bodies spoke of a ferocity of combat that taxed the limits of transhuman physiology. Terminator suits, the pinnacle of personal protection technology in the Imperium, were rent asunder. Massive plasteel pauldrons were sheared in half by monomolecular claws. Helmets were crushed, visors shattered, revealing the grim, frozen expressions of the veterans within. Many of the warriors had clearly run dry of ammunition long before the end. They were found with combat knives buried to the hilt in the necks of Tyranid warriors, or with their power fists clamped inextricably around the throats of the beasts that had killed them. In the center of the room, the pile of Tyranid dead was a hill, a grotesque monument to the lethality of the First Company. The Astartes had built a fortification out of their enemies. To kill one Terminator, the hive mind had been forced to sacrifice hundreds of its own creatures. The sheer density of the alien corpses was such that in some places, the Tyranids had been unable to reach the Marines with their claws and had simply been crushed to death by the weight of the swarm pressing from behind, suffocated against the active power fields of the Terminators. The psychological impact of this discovery upon the survivors of the relief force was immediate and profound. Space Marines are conditioned to know no fear, to accept death as the ultimate service to the Emperor. Yet, the sight of the First Company, the invincible heroes of the chapter, the men who had trained the current captains, the repository of 1,000 years of tactical wisdom, reduced to silent husks, was a trauma that cut through the psycho-conditioning. This was not merely the loss of soldiers, it was the lobotomy of the chapter. The First Company represented the institutional memory of the Ultramarines. These were the warriors who knew the specific rituals of the oldest battle barges, who had memorized the tactical nuances of wars fought before the current scouts were even born. They were the mentors, the living links to the history of the 13th Legion. Their destruction meant that centuries of accumulated experience, the subtle arts of war that could not be written in a codex, but only passed down from veteran to aspirant, were extinguished in a single week of darkness. Furthermore, the material loss was catastrophic. The tactical dreadnought armor worn by the veterans was irreplaceable. Each suit was a relic, an artifact of the dark age of technology or the Great Crusade, maintained with religious fervor by the Tech Marines. They contained fragments of the Crux Terminatus, said to bear a shard of the Emperor's own armor. To see these sacred machines torn apart, their servos fused and their machine spirits silenced, was a blasphemy made manifest. The Tech Marines accompanying Calgar fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in despair, running their mechadendrites over the shattered breastplates, cataloging damage that the forges of Macragge would take centuries to repair if they ever could. The apothecaries moved among the dead with solemn urgency. Their task was the most grim and vital of all, the recovery of the gene seed. The future of the chapter lay within the progenid glands of the fallen. To lose the gene seed of the entire veteran cadre would be a death sentence for the chapter's genetic lineage, a degradation of the stock that could lead to the slow extinction of the Ultramarines. The sound of the reductor tools drilling into the chests of the dead, cracking open the fused ceramite to harvest the glands, echoed in the silent hall, a wet, mechanical noise that served as the only funeral rite the first company would receive. As the search teams moved to the upper gantry of the generatorium, near the primary interface for the orbital laser, they found the command squad. Here lay the body of Captain Saul Invictus. The captain of the first company had died standing. He was pinned to the bulkhead by the massive, barbed spear limb of a Hive tyrant, the creature itself dead at his feet, its skull pulverized by the captain's thunder hammer. Invictus's armor was a ruin, his chest plate dissolved by acid, but his grip on his weapon was unbroken. Even in death, he barred the way to the control console, his body serving as the final lock on the door. Near the captain, amidst a circle of 6 dead carnifexes, the searchers found the Ancient. The standard bearer of the first company had been the focal point of the alien assault, the target of the swarm's instinctive hatred for the iconography of the Imperium. His body was unrecognizable, a broken mass of ceramite and flesh, buried beneath the corpses of the monsters he had slain. Yet, rising from the carnage, untouched by the gore that coated the floor, was the banner of Macragge, the sacred standard, woven from threads of adamantium and gold, depicting the heraldry of the chapter and the honors won across 10,000 years of war, was not lying in the dirt. The Ancient, in his final moments, had driven the banner pole into the grate of the deck plating and locked his gauntlets around it. Rigor mortis and the locking mechanisms of his power armor had fused him to the standard. He had died holding it aloft. The banner of Macragge stood upright, defiant in the gloom. It hung still in the stagnant air, its golden eagles and laurel wreaths shimmering in the light of the apothecary's lamps. It was a stark, piercing symbol amidst the devastation. The Tyranids had killed the warriors, they had breached the walls, and they had silenced the guns, but they had not toppled the standard. The imagery was visceral and agonizingly poignant. The body was broken, but the spirit remained standing. Calgar approached the banner, his limp pronounced, the servos of his damaged armor whining in protest. He reached out with a trembling power fist, touching the fabric of the standard. It was a connection to the brothers he had sent to their deaths, a tactile confirmation of the price of survival. The men of the Second Company and the Auxilia stood in silence, watching their lord. There were no speeches, no oaths of vengeance. The magnitude of the sacrifice rendered words trivial. The silence of the North was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. The First Company had bought the life of Macragge with their own, and the receipt was written in the blood that slicked the floor of the generatorium. The recovery operations began immediately, driven by a desperate need to reclaim the legacy of the fallen before the feral Tyranids lurking in the lower tunnels could desecrate the bodies further. Thunderhawks were called in, landing in the cleared debris of the courtyard to ferry the dead back to the fortress of Hera. Each Terminator suit was lifted with reverence, carried by cranes and servitors, treated not as wreckage but as the body of a martyr. The banner of Macragge was cut from the grip of the Ancient, the pole requiring a plasma cutter to free it from the fused gauntlets, and was carried out by the chapter master himself. As the column began the slow trek back to the capital, leaving the empty, silent shell of the northern polar fortress behind, the reality of the victory settled upon the chapter. The threat of Hive Fleet Behemoth was ended, but the Ultramarines were a shadow of their former strength. The invincible aura of the First Company was gone, replaced by the cold truth of their mortality. The scouring of Macragge had only just begun, a war of extermination against the surviving organisms that would last for years, but the soul of the chapter had been forged anew in the freezing dark of the pole, harder, colder, and infinitely more brittle. The silence that descended upon the northern polar fortress was not the quiet of peace, but the hollow, ringing stillness of a graveyard. The wind whistled through the shattered ferrocrete of the generatorium, carrying with it the copper tang of Astartes' blood and the cloying, chemical stench of dissolving alien ichor. For the relief force standing amidst the carnage, the victory over Hive Fleet Behemoth felt less like a triumph and more like an amputation. The First Company was gone. The veterans, the repository of the chapter's martial history and tactical wisdom, had been extinguished to the last man. As the apothecaries moved among the dead, their reductor tools whining as they drilled through cracked ceramite to harvest the gene seed, the full weight of the cost began to settle upon the Ultramarines. This was a wound that would not heal with the passing of a season or a campaign. It was a scar upon the soul of the chapter that would take centuries to fade. The recovery of the first company's gene seed was the immediate priority, a task performed with grim industrial efficiency. The progenitor glands, the biological keys to the future of the chapter, had to be retrieved before the freezing temperatures or the lingering toxins of the Tyranid dead compromised the genetic material. Each gland harvested was a small victory, a guarantee that the lineage of the fallen warrior would continue in a neophyte yet to be born. However, the loss of the living men presented a logistical and spiritual crisis. A veteran of the first company is not merely a soldier with better aim. He is a warrior with centuries of combat experience, one who has earned the crux terminatus through acts of supreme valor. To replace one such man takes a lifetime of war. To replace an entire company takes an age. For the next 250 years, the first company of the Ultramarines would remain under strength. The chapter master could not simply promote warriors to fill the ranks. The honor had to be earned, and the experience had to be lived. The suits of tactical dreadnought armor, recovered from the ice and repaired by the master artificers of the forge, stood empty in the Hall of Heroes for decades. They were silent sentinels, waiting for warriors worthy enough to don them. The rebuilding process was slow and methodical, dictated by the strict standards of the chapter. It would be generations before the first company could once again deploy at full strength, a lingering reminder of the price paid to keep Macragge free. Amidst the mourning and the reconstruction, a singular figure emerged from the wreckage of the war, not as a ghost, but as a weapon forged in the fires of hatred. Chaplain Orton Cassius, the spiritual leader of the first company, had not died with his brothers in the final dark hours of the Generatorium. Earlier in the siege, during the defense of the outer perimeter, Cassius had fallen to a carnifex, his body crushed and broken by the beast's massive strength. He had been dragged from the front lines by his fellow Astartes and evacuated via Thunderhawk to the Apothecarian at the Fortress of Hera, clinging to life by the barest thread of his transhuman physiology. When Cassius awoke from his medically induced coma, weeks after the guns had fallen silent, he was a changed being. His ruined body had been rebuilt with extensive bionics. Adamantium replaced shattered bone, and synthetic muscle grafts reinforced his torn flesh. Half of his face was now a metallic mask, his remaining organic eye burning with a cold, fanatical light. But the physical reconstruction paled in comparison to the transformation of his spirit. When he learned of the fate of his company, that he was the sole survivor of the veteran cadre's command structure, he did not succumb to despair. Instead, his grief crystallized into a singular burning obsession, the total eradication of the Tyranid race. Cassius recognized that the standard tactical doctrines of the Adeptus Astartes, and even the Holy Codex itself, were insufficient against the Great Devourer. The Tyranids did not fight for territory or ideology, they fought to consume. They felt no fear, suffered no morale shock, and adapted to standard bolter drills with terrifying speed. To fight them, the Ultramarines needed to evolve. Cassius petitioned Marnius Calgar to sanction the formation of a new, specialized unit. He gathered the survivors of the Tyrannic War, veterans from other companies who had faced the swarm and lived, and formed the Tyrannic War Veterans. This formation was a radical departure from the rigid organization of the Ultramarines. These warriors did not display the pristine, uniform heraldry typical of the sons of Guilliman. Their armor was often scarred, adorned with trophies taken from the alien dead, chitin plates, claws, and skulls used as fetishes to mark their kills. This was a practice bordering on the barbaric, usually frowned upon by the Codex, but Calgar, recognizing the necessity of such specialized warfare, allowed it. Under Cassius's tutelage, these veterans trained not in the broad spectrum of war, but in the specific art of killing Xeno's biological organisms. They learned the weak points of a carnifex, the synaptic reliance of the warrior broods, and the telltale signs of genestealer infiltration. The tactical shifts introduced by Cassius and authorized by Calgar rippled through the chapter's doctrine. The most significant material adaptation was the widespread deployment of Hellfire rounds, standard mass reactive bolts designed to explode inside a target, often failed against the massive, redundant organs of the larger Tyranid bioforms. A Tyranid warrior could lose half its torso and still fight on. Hellfire rounds replaced the explosive core with a vial of mutagenic acid. Upon impact, thousands of ceramic needles shattered the vial, injecting the acid directly into the target's bloodstream. The toxin was engineered to denature organic matter on a cellular level, liquefying the creature from the inside out. It was a cruel, horrific weapon, but against an enemy that knew no pain, it was necessary. Furthermore, the Codex Astartes was amended with addendums of experience regarding anti-swarm tactics. The Ultramarines moved away from the static defensive lines that had cost them so dearly at the polar fortresses. Instead, they adopted fluid, mobile kill zones. Squads were drilled to target the synapse creatures, the leaders, above all else. The doctrine of head of the snake became paramount. If a Hive Tyrant or a Warrior Prime was on the field, all fire support was directed to eliminate it immediately, severing the synaptic link and reducing the swarm to a rabble of feral beasts. Heavy flamers and whirlwind artillery tanks were prioritized in fleet loadouts, their ability to clear biomass deemed more critical than the anti-armor capability of las cannons when facing the Tyranids. The formation of the tyrannic war veterans and the tactical adaptations ensured that the lessons of Macragge were not lost. Cassius himself became a legend within the chapter, a terrifying figure who preached the catechisms of hate with a fervor that unnerved even his battle brothers. He was no longer just a chaplain, he was the master of sanctity, the conscience of the chapter, constantly reminding them that the galaxy held horrors that could not be negotiated with, only exterminated. As the years turned into decades, and the physical scars on Macragge began to be covered by new growth and fresh snow, a disquieting realization began to take hold within the high command of the Imperium. The Inquisition, analyzing the biological data recovered from the husks of the bioships, and the Magos Biologes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, studying the growth rates of the swarm, came to a chilling conclusion. Hive Fleet Behemoth was not a singular invasion force. It was not a migration of a species seeking a new home. It was a probe. The sheer density of the biomass that had attacked Macragge was astronomical, yet in the context of the void between galaxies, it represented only a fraction of a greater whole. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided humanity through the warp, was beginning to flicker along the eastern fringe, obscured by a shadow far larger than the one cast by Behemoth. Deep-range augurs and astropathic choirs began to pick up disturbances that defied logic, movements of biological mass, so vast they looked like nebulae on the sensors. The defeat of Behemoth had bought the Imperium time, but it had not bought safety. It had merely been the opening volley of a war for the survival of the species. The Tyranids were not a raiding party. They were an extragalactic super predator that had finished consuming its local cluster and was now moving into the Milky Way to feed. Behemoth was the vanguard, the fingertips of a hand reaching out of the dark. Reports began to filter in from sectors far removed from Ultramar. On the galactic southeast, worlds were going silent in patterns that matched the approach of Behemoth. This new threat, designated Hive Fleet Kraken, was different. Where Behemoth had been a hammer, smashing through defenses with brute force, Kraken was a scourge, splitting into hundreds of splinter fleets that enveloped entire sectors, attacking everywhere at once to stretch the defenders to the breaking point. And behind Kraken, lurking in the deep void below the galactic plane, the augurs whispered of something even larger, a leviathan rising from the depths, a fleet of such magnitude that it threatened to swallow the segmentum solar itself. The Battle of Macragge ended with the Ultramarines standing victorious, but it was a victory comprised of ashes. They had looked into the face of the great devourer and survived, but in doing so they had glimpsed the true scale of the threat facing the galaxy. The peace of Ultramar was a fragile illusion, maintained by the constant vigilance of the survivors. The first company would eventually be rebuilt, the gene seed would be cultivated, and the fortresses would be repaired, but the certainty of the past was gone. The galaxy was no longer the domain of humanity, beset by rebels and traitors. It was a hunting ground, and as Marnius Calgar looked out from the high spires of the Fortress of Hera toward the stars, he knew that the war against the Tyranids had not ended on the ice of the North Pole. It had only just begun.